Canon, Civilization, and Critical Thought talk and seminar panel at today's forum. And we're going to start off with a talk by Robert Switzer. Robert is Dean of the Undergraduate Studies and Director of the Core Curriculum at the American University in Cairo, as well as an Associate Professor in AUC's Department of Philosophy. Rob has also been a member of the faculty at the University of Alabama, Huntsville, Queen's University in Canada, John Cabot University, Rome, and the Collegium Phenomenologicum in Perugia. His research interests are mainly centered on the history of philosophy and recent continental thought, but also range from the ethics of economic development to the philosophy of music. Recent publications include Ambient Soundscapes Toward a Phenomenology of Musical Space, Raging Discordance, Heidegger, Nietzsche on Truth and Art, and new interpretations of Heidegger's confrontation with Nietzsche. Join me in welcoming Rob Switzer to our panel today.
I guess we can turn those lights off so people can see my PowerPoint a little bit better. Oh, what happened? All right, I'm going to have to stand here, so because I've got a lot of slides, some of them go by very quickly. Let me say, first of all, I'm very, very happy to be here. I always think of AUB as sort of our sister institution along with AUC. We were originally the American University at Cairo, and it's interesting, the little word at or of. Then we became the American University in Cairo. And I honestly think we should change the name to the American University near Cairo. Because honestly, you know, we're not even that close anymore. We've moved from Tahrir Square out to the exurbs, which has been a traumatic experience for some of us. We're still, many of us, very nostalgic for the old days, but it's a beautiful campus, as is yours. And both of us really represent something that remains very unique in the region, which is the commitment to liberal arts, an American-style liberal arts education. And it is, I think, something that is increasingly relevant, and people are starting to recognize the importance of it, which I think is a great thing. Very briefly, I want to talk a little bit about what's been going on at the core, in the core at AUC. I want to talk about a course that I taught 2 sections of every semester for some 20 years until I got this recent gig, and even then I've been doing it a little bit, and that is a course called Philosophical Thinking, which is required of all of our students at AUC, and finally concluding unscientific postscript. In terms of the core, given the topic of the session, I guess the question, the summary is less canon, maybe. I think we moved a little bit away from the canon, but hopefully we have more impact. Philosophical Thinking is a course where we really do focus, though, on what we were just talking about Walter Lammy. He called eminent texts, and it still is in our official syllabus for the course. We focus on eminent texts, but our real focus is on critical thinking and reading. And then finally, this is an ambitious title, but you know, the point is to really think about the canon in the 21st century, where we might be going with it. A little bit of background. I'm not going to try to read everything that's here, but the point is, when I arrived, which is 1991, there was just a core curriculum office. It was tucked away in the corner of the campus next to the freshman advising office. And over in the 2000s, there was a lot of development, a lot of sort of an effort to redefine the core. And earlier, Ferhat Ghazul had mentioned the freshman seminar, which had been a hallmark of AUC in the 70s and 80s. And in the 90s, it was changed to Seminar 200, which was a required course at the sophomore level. Very much a canon course, as we'll come back to. In the 2000s, it was replaced by a basket of courses. There was, you know, this sort of a cafeteria approach. And it was brought back a few years later by demand of the students, believe it or not, as well as a few faculty, but as an elective within the new primary level, and that's what it remains today. We also developed a dialogues project, which was a distance learning and teleconference course, which still remains very successful. We focused on developing a primary level, and actually Dr. Ghazul again developed a wonderful course that is still being taught in the English and Comparative Literature Department. And they introduced the core postdoctoral fellows program, of which one of the people here was a member. We also we went through a very traumatic process of reducing the Arab world requirement from 9 to 6 credits. And we, at the same time, developed a course in International World Studies, which we now call Global Studies, and we introduced the capstone requirement, which really didn't kick in until around the time that I became core director. So I sort of inherited this project and tried to make sense out of it. It's an ambitious idea, and it's not easy to do. Again, by that point, we had an advising office in 2010, and the seminar had been renamed as Seminar 123. The first year that I was the dean, they established this new office, the Dean of Undergraduate Studies and Director of the Core. We were developing the various ideas. The provost established 2 task forces on these issues of advising and the freshman year. And by 2012, we had changed the advising to an advising center. We had set up a council for discussions around advising registration issues, which has proven to be very effective. We have moved a community-based learning program, which has really had no home, and it's now located in my office, as well as an Office of Undergraduate Research, which again had been an initiative on the part of a number of faculty, but really had no funding or no home. And as I hope you'll see, a lot of these issues really tie together in terms of what we conceive as the core of an education at AUC. In 2013, we had those same things that I just mentioned, but we also brought on board a new freshman program, which was very difficult to do because we had to offer the old program and the new program at the same time. And they also moved, you know, they saw there was a dean. They said, oh, what else can we throw at him? So they sent over about 115 faculty members in these 3 departments. And so that on the one hand added a lot of extra work, but it also created some interesting synergies. The ELI department, English Language Instruction, is really a bridge program. It provides intensive academic English for students who don't have sufficient strength. And that, of course, adds to our diversity, because we have students that are able to come to AUC that may be quite brilliant, but they don't have the level of English that's needed, of academic English. So we've worked on that, and the Arabic language instruction is really one of the things that has made AUC world famous, but unfortunately the international students are not there right now, and they're struggling a lot. And the Department of Rhetoric and Composition, formerly the freshman writing program, is really now at the center, as you'll see, of our freshman program, and therefore in a sense of the whole core curriculum. And they are have made this transition to a new role very well. Again, we had some of these things in 2014 that you already saw. We had the freshman program. We introduced a common reading program. We've introduced a peer advising leaders program, the PAL program, which is senior and junior students that are helping the freshmen. So all these pieces that are focused on one of the issues that was discussed earlier, which is how do you, to use a blunt, socialize or indoctrinate a set of students who really have no idea what they're getting into when they come to a university like AUC or AUB. How do you make them understand and appreciate and fit into a culture rather than simply, find their way, become very unhappy, get into a major that they're really not suited for, dig themselves into a GPA hole, drop out, whatever it is. So we've really put a lot of emphasis into that. We've also done a lot of emphasis on experiential learning, and we had something called the Cairo in the Curriculum Initiative, which has basically said we should use Cairo as a textbook. And in a way, it's relevant to the whole issue of the canon. How do you conceptualize an eminent text, a great book? Well, the cities that we live in are, in a sense, couldn't be surpassed as brilliant texts that we can draw on for our teaching and learning. Again, this last year, some of the same things. We've moved the Writing Center over. We have literacy programs that are now part of what we do to, again, experiential learning and community-based learning. Our faculty and our students helping not just to go out into the community, but actually working with our own staff in terms of English language literacy. And also working with some of the school areas in Cairo and Vermont. So this is very much a growth area for us. We also have another new initiative, which is a co-curricular transcript, where my office is very involved with the Office of Student Development. Essentially, it's the same kind of theme. Learning is not confined to the classroom. What the students do, we have a very active club culture, very active student engagement on their own, but we've never had a system of trying to integrate that into a semi-official record of student achievement. So if you've been a captain of the football team, if you've been head of the help club, if you've presented a paper at a conference or sung in the opera house, and some of our students have done those things, this will be something that's officially noted as a transcript, a co-curricular transcript that the university will issue. We've also started exploring the e-portfolio as something that, again, is really focused on student ownership of their learning, student reflection on learning outcomes and how they're achieving them, and really trying to put the pieces together. And so far, it's worked extremely well. The students actually have taken to it. Of course, they're much more comfortable with these digital environments than any of us are. And that's been interesting. We'd like to see that grow. We've also established a new office to collect together the PAL program with the FYE student orientation. That was started about 10 years ago with the name of the first year experience, but in fact it was only a 4-day orientation. We didn't have anything to connect with it really over the year. Now we're trying to put pieces together, co-curricular activities, the Common Reading Program, the PAL program, and a whole series of things in and outside of the classroom that are in a very intensive approach to the experience of our freshmen. And the results so far have been extremely good. I passed out the brochures. Obviously, I didn't have enough for everyone. If you happen to have one, you know, share it, pass it around if anyone's interested. This is sort of the centerpiece of our core brochure. It's simply a summary. We have, well, this is actually different, but this is a fundraising document. It's also known as the pyramids. We have this thing about pyramids. But anyways, what we've done is, as you can see, there's a tandem course, the RET and Core 1010. And I'll come back to that, but it's very crucial to what we're trying to do. It's the first semester of every freshman's experience at AUC. The Bridge program students are no longer thought of as freshmen. They're in the Bridge. When they move up into the RET Core, they begin their freshman experience. And it's a common experience for all the students. And that, I think, is very important. It's a 6-credit tandem class, so 2 3-credit courses taught usually by the same faculty member, the same group of students. And they get to know each other. They feel the relevance of what they're learning in the writing class because they bring those skills to bear on a topic in the core seminar. And we do also introduce some learning skills, some library skills, and so on. And the same thing happens in the second semester when they take RET 1020, which is research writing. And we're connecting that more and more closely with the 0-credit library and learning technologies course on information literacy, where they have to learn how to use some of the library resources and internet resources for research. Scientific thinking is a course that's been around for decades, and it's a little bit like what we were hearing earlier about the course that Columbia has, Science Frontiers. The agenda of that course is far too large for any course to do. You know, they're introducing the history of science, introducing scientific literacy and critical thinking, doing group projects, talking about the big ideas, Big Bang, trying to help students understand what evolution is, even if they don't necessarily believe in it, and so on. And so it's an impossible task, but it's nonetheless, through the resourcefulness of the faculty, I think it manages to be pretty successful. Again, it's one of the 2 courses that every student at AUC has to take. Scientific thinking and its sister course, philosophical thinking, which, as you can see, is sort of culminating of the freshman program in the usually 3rd semester. Alongside that, students have to take 2 courses. We used to say that those courses were, well, one was a science course with lab, and the other one was a humanities social science requirement. And we used to have a rule that if you took humanities in the primary level, then you had to take social science in the secondary level. And that got us into all sorts of issues about how you classify the course. Is it humanities, is it social science? And it seemed like the direction that we were going in was to be much less focused on discipline and far more focused on interdisciplinary, problems-oriented classes that really brought the students, that engaged the students in thinking and looking at issues from various perspectives. So the idea of trying to classify the various interesting courses that the faculty came up with became more and more problematic. So now we simply say, if you took a course in history at the freshman level, try to take a course in another department at your secondary level. And we sort of police that, but not as closely as we could. So this has moved from a breadth issue to really an engagement issue, and that's why we're calling them pathways courses. The idea is to open up. I mean, when we built the new campus, we called it a city of learning. And the idea here is that these open up different pathways into this city, different ways in which students can learn and explore and hopefully come back and explore further. It also is a chance for them to meet some of the faculty that teach in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences and perhaps get interested in the different majors, but that's not the primary focus. The secondary levels actually had basically unchanged, except that we have fewer Arab World Studies class requirements than we used to, and there's a lot more choice. So it is basically a breadth issue. And then we have the capstone, which includes a capstone within the major in virtually every one of our majors. And so that's left up to the departments. And then we have the rather daunting idea of a capstone outside the major. You know, how do you develop a course that is at the 400 level, that is rigorous and demanding, and yet is open to students that are not specialists in that field? It's not easy, and some faculty just don't get it at all. And others have really seen that this makes a lot of sense and that it can work. The economics department as of yet hasn't done this, but I think to me it's a really good example. Every student should have an idea of how economics works and what it's all about, and it affects every field. And you could have a class that wasn't mathematically intensive, but that introduced some very advanced and difficult concepts in a way that would equip students as they go into the world with knowledge and thinking experience, and debating experience, and writing and reasoning experience that they really do need. These courses should be interdisciplinary. The ideal of a capstone outside the major would be to have students who are at this point anthropologists or political scientists or physicists or engineers or business people coming together with their various specializations and their various perspectives to discuss common themes and interacting with each other, doing group projects and presentations and debates, and coming out of this really having applied the things that the core curriculum is all about. So we're still working on this. It's an ambitious but difficult project. But anyway, so that's our core curriculum in a nutshell. And as I mentioned, the freshman program has a very particular structure. These are actually from slides that I share with the students. Again, we're trying to help them understand from day one what it is they're getting into. And so as part of that, we give them a sort of rundown of what they're getting into, and then we also present to them. Well, this is actually not for them. This is just to summarize some of the things we're doing. We're moving away from the cafeteria approach, as I mentioned. We're trying to have a more laddered approach to the reading that the students do, so that it's not starting off as difficult as it might, but it moves up. Culminating, as I said, in philosophical thinking, where you read people like Descartes, who are difficult even if you're a native speaker of English. And the emphasis on academic skills and helping students understand what the core is all about as they take it, as they're about to take it, rather than years afterwards. Because this is an experience that we have at AUC as well. Everyone seemed, over the years, to hate the core, unless you happen to run into an alumni on the streets, and then they suddenly loved it. Right? Then they look back and said, you know, that was the only worthwhile thing I took at AUC. I still remember the books we read. I still, you know, and it was something that was so universal. It was really amazing. And of course, maybe they were just being nice to me as an old teacher that had taught them philosophical thinking, but it was a pretty universal story. So in a sense, we're simply trying to front load this to help them understand in advance why they're doing this, how useful it is for them, and where the benefits are. And I'll come back, of course, to the whole issue of benefits. This is what we share with the students. This is a user-friendly set of learning outcomes. And it's really trying to say, you know, this is what this is trying to do. And in language that hopefully isn't as off-putting as the sort of official language we use. So critical thinking, information literacy, obviously writing, critical reading. Teamwork, which is, again, something that's somewhat new, but given the importance of that in the world of work, it seemed like it's something that is best to start early. Because often you get to a capstone course and you expect the students to be able to make presentations, and they've had no training in it. And they also expect them to work effectively in groups, and they've never done it. So we're trying to start early with both oral skills and teamwork. And then finally, we've introduced a requirement, or at least an outcome that's tied to ethics and civic engagement. We're still not completely sure how this is going to translate into practice in the sense that it's very difficult to get an entire, cadre of 1,200 students, put them on a bus and send them out into the community. The logistics of that kind of thing, and frankly, what good are they going to do? So we're thinking of starting small in that regard. And also, we do have courses like philosophical thinking. Whenever you start talking about the death of Socrates and what he says to the Athenians in the Apology, you're already problematizing the whole issue of the academic and his or her relation to the community, the engagement of the conscience and consciousness that is involved in academic life into the community and what the community perhaps owes back, and so on. So these issues have already been problematized in our courses. We're simply trying to be more self-conscious and intentional about it, which is sort of true across the board. That's really the thinking of our freshman program. These are just some of the courses, sort of picked at random, that we've been offering. This creative thinking and problem-solving course is one where I think we call that a Pathways to course, and that is a sort of humanities social science course, but it's clearly about science as much as it is about humanities or social science. So even that boundary is starting to break down, and I think rightly so. We have a number of courses. For example, we have faculty teaching courses in sustainability, which are they're very science heavy, they're also humanities and social science heavy. And we're trying to break down barriers that are institutionally quite well established. This is an example of the Cairo and the curriculum. This is a freshman level course where the students engage with the city. And this is one of the core 1010 courses. This originally was 110, called Imagining Exile. So you can see that we still have a lot of emphasis on books, not necessarily canonical in the old-fashioned sense. What we've been doing, and I want to make sure I don't spend too long on this because I wanted to get to some other things, but we have been trying to move in a direction where, as you can see, we're focusing much more on learning outcomes rather than content, and that really is the main focus. More on skills. We're focusing on innovative course design and innovative pedagogies. The capstone requirement I mentioned. We want to have an award for innovative course design. Assessing the core we heard about earlier, it's a very, very difficult thing to do. We're working on that. Integration with the majors. We are sending a team to a summer institute for the AAC&U, and we'll see what bright ideas they come back with. And high impact practices. The AAC&U is always talking about this, and someone said, well, you're the hip dean. And I thought, oh, that's nice. But yeah, we're really trying to be hip with all of these practices. We have the 4-day orientation. We have advising that is now very much integrated into the freshman program. That's also under my office, as you heard. Student-led peer mentoring, the bridge program, the tandem community of learning course, the 1010 course. I mean, these are the kind of things that AAC&U is saying we should be doing. And it's great to go to the conference because we say, oh yeah, we're doing that. We're already doing it. So, common reading program, the linkages, the learning and teaching support from CLT and the Writing Center. And really a growth area for us in our strategic plan is community-based learning. And again, it's a question of how we get there, logistically in terms of bringing it into the curriculum. But there's no question that our students are very motivated, they're very community-oriented in their thinking, and we want to connect that into the curriculum and really build on that impulse. As I said, these are things we're moving towards, e-portfolios, bringing in a universal community engagement requirement, linkages and clusters in the core, and greater student ownership of the core is the ultimate goal. Students still tend to look at it as a bunch of hoops they need to jump through. And what we want is for them to look at the core as an opportunity for them to put together the pieces of an education. And one of the things that we've talked about earlier is that academics tend to be specialized. By the time they finish their PhD, they tend to be hyper-specialized. And yet what we expect in our students is the connections, the broader perspective. We're often not very good examples of this. And maybe rather than try to be good examples, we should shift the focus to the students themselves. Let them put the pieces together. Give them the opportunities, such as in e-portfolios, and in developing at graduation some kind of a signature project that basically is something they put their name on, they identify with, they own, and that they build up over not just one semester, but ideally over a couple of years. So that's sort of the direction we'd like to go in. Now, the Canon. And Yeah, I guess I'm doing okay. I just wanted to give you some idea of the core curriculum at AUC. But one of the main changes is we have moved away from the Canon. I think that's fair to say. This was a required class sometime around, as you can see here, 1995. I did this partly from memory, because I taught this course. The reason that I taught it was I did it as an overload because I saw the faculty, you know, leaving this class, engaged with each other, going off and having conversations afterwards. I really felt I was missing out on something. And when I taught it for 3 semesters as an overload, I really enjoyed it. Unfortunately, the faculty maybe felt burned out, or some of them didn't enjoy it, and it was really the faculty that brought it to an end. Although the students obviously did complain about this amount of reading, even though this was a second-year course. Now the course survives, and about almost 25% of our students still take it, and they take it because they choose to take it. And I think we could probably fit more, except for the logistics of classroom, large lecture halls, and things like that. So it's actually done okay, but it's no longer universally required. And as you can see, the reading list is considerably less. This is now a 100 level course. So, you know, but you know, they get an arrangement of things, a range of things, and it's a little less canonical, but you know, maybe not. And of course, Gilgamesh is still there, and that's the nice thing. So as you can see, that's the old arrangement, and this is the new one. So it's quite a bit different. But nonetheless, we do have a focus, and these are again just a few courses that are being offered: literature and cinema. Some of these courses, you can't really see them probably in much detail, but you can see that there is still a great deal of focus on reading and, you know, in a sense, canonical and extra-canonical texts. And some of these courses are really interesting, and of course we're encouraging faculty to make them attractive to students beyond the major in the core curriculum. All these courses are meet core curriculum requirements of various kinds. So I really want to talk about philosophical thinking, which is a course, as I said, that I taught for a long, long time. And this class is still very much focused on eminent texts. But as I said, the eminence of these texts is perhaps the question. Significant texts that have lasting value, certainly. I actually rather like the reference that was made earlier this morning to self-reflective texts. I think that was very intriguing to me, because I think many of them are. Certainly Plato strikes me that way. One of the goals in this course is to continue this process of explaining what liberal arts is and really showing it to students. One of the emphasis is indeed to ensure this kind of cultural literacy, as people used to say back in the 80s. That was a huge issue in the 1980s. But you know, to give some sense of the sweep of the intellectual life, and I say Western in quotation marks or brackets, because in fact I always talk about Al-Ghazali before I talk about Descartes. And Plato is really pretty universal, both certainly to the Islamic philosophical tradition as well as the so-called West. And that's another story that I certainly think we all tend to focus on, which is you wouldn't have Western philosophy if it hadn't been for the tremendous contributions of Arab and Islamic philosophy in the Middle Ages. So there't a lot to be said there. And of course, critical thinking. Critical thinking is the sort of the key thing here, but you know, as one of the things I think we're going to talk about, what is meant by that? AUC, in one of its documents, has this overall definition of critical thinking. It's not bad, but the focus is obviously on complex information being synthesized and analyzed so that students can solve problems. Very practically oriented. And I suppose my response is, well, philosophy certainly poses problems, but it doesn't always solve them. And maybe that's not always the point, is solving things. But then, you know, I thought about, well, Descartes would disagree, right? And we'll come back to this. Descartes at the bottom, talking about how the tree of knowledge is judged by its fruits, the products of benefits. But the other issue is I mentioned the idea that philosophy is useless. And we often say that to the students, just to get their attention. And the strength is how useless it is, because of course they want to know, is this on the test? What do I need to memorize? How is this going to help me get that first job when I graduate? What we're really saying to the students is it may appear to be useless, and it may not help you get that first job. You won't dazzle your interviewee with your understanding of Descartes' proofs. But in your second and your third job and your fourth job, as you continue through your career, this is going to help you a lot. The kind of thinking that you're going to learn how to do, the kind of larger picture thinking, is really what it's all about. So this is the kind of thing that we've really done with this course over the years. And the nice thing is that the students like it. I think people thought when it was introduced in 1990 or 91 that it would never last. And in fact, we now have a BA and an MA program basically built on the fact that the students quite like something that they are totally not prepared to like. When they're in high school, they're told that Falsafia is nonsense. And it's usually quite commonly part of the curriculum. And when they come to AUC, they actually learn that it's kind of interesting. So as you see here, I've tried to break this down a little bit in terms of how we approach this. The sympathetic understanding is probably the most important thing. That you don't start with this hostility, you have to enter into the world of the writer. And the interpretation of difficult passages. In this course, we don't do a book a week. We tend to do 3 works, and we don't even necessarily assign the entire work. We do maybe a couple of Platonic dialogues. We certainly wouldn't do the whole Republic. We would do the entire Meditations of Descartes, but we wouldn't ask them to read the entire book of, say, Nietzsche's Gay Science. We would give them excerpts. We might ask them to read maybe about a quarter or a third of the book, but not the whole thing. So it's relatively light in terms of the amount of reading. But on the other hand, the reading is very difficult, and it is, for all of us who teach it, it's focusing on a close reading of text, very demanding text. This is from a syllabus that I first used in the early 90s, and that basically I still use now. Basically saying that the course is about questioning. That's the main thing. It's not about answers, it's more about questions. And questioning is one of the most important things we can do. It's to say that, yes, there is a history of ideas, but it's not the focusing on that so much as to see that ideas that themselves actually have a history. It's to recognize that we are embedded in the background. In other words, already at that point, I was justifying the turn to these significant texts in terms of their relevance to understanding the world we're in now. Things didn't just happen. And there are certain philosophers, like Russell, who tends to think that philosophy was born in the last century or something. But in fact, no, you have to go back to the Greeks. I don't mean to pick on Bertrand Russell. It's, anyways. So, and then I went on to say that it's all about active reading. This is something that is one of the hardest things to get our students to do, is to bring the book to class and bring a pencil. Yes, right? And underline things, and put question marks next to things. So it's a constant challenge, but I think it makes a huge difference once they start to pick that up. I'm not going to read all of that, but so again, I say that philosophy is useless. It's really is that it's about thinking. It's about ideas. It's not about content, and it's not about immediate, obvious benefits of something, how this is going to help you in the short run. It's a much more long-term thing. And it's in fact kind of liberating for the students to start to enter into this world where it is just ideas for their own sake. They take well to it. But nonetheless, I also say right in the beginning of the class that it helps you solve problems. And so I give them this problem, which is perhaps familiar to some of you. I just call it the 9-dot problem. And in fact, many of you have probably already seen this. If you haven't seen it before, you can try to solve it if you have a pencil and a paper. I saw this when I was a kid. I was very young, and it left an impression on me that I never forgot. And fortunately, very few, virtually none of the students that I've ever taught have ever seen this before, even though it's quite well known. And so they enjoy it. This is the assignment. When you have those 9 dots, you have to draw 4 lines. When you end one line, you start a new one, and you have to draw those lines through all 9 dots. And when you first try it, it seems to be completely impossible. And I'll come back to it, just to give you a little chance to solve the problem. So that, again, that's what it looks like, your 9 dots. And by the way, when I get the students to think about that, I say, well, what do you see when you look at that? And they say, a square. I say, how many? And they say 4. And then they say 5. Right? So that's very quick. But they never see the diamond in the middle. Right? That's also a square. I mean, I don't say never, but it's very rare. If I push them, they'll start to say, oh yeah, there's another square. It's on its end. So it is about how we see. It's about how we arrange information. That's the whole point of the exercise. We also tend to look at this famous saying of Socrates, and I ask the students to disagree with you. It's easy to agree. So, and of course, it's also easy for them to disagree because in various ways, many of them have been encouraged to think that looking at your own life too closely and examining questions and asking questions and questioning authority is something that, it gets you into trouble. And of course, in the last year or two, that looks to be the case again in Cairo. And so it's really an interesting exercise to collect up all of the reasons why you shouldn't examine life, why you shouldn't reflect, why you shouldn't ask too many questions. Unfortunately, there was just 1 year where the students seemed to think that was the point. Right? But other than that, they always got it. That wasn't the point. But that year, ever since that year, I added this slide. Let's not just, like to really spell it out. But we also want to be in favor of this saying, and to make sure that there was just one influential student that affected everyone else in thinking, yes, the point is don't question. Well, no, that's not the point. So we also go through the exercise of saying what can we say in favor of it. And this, of course, brings up the whole idea of the liberal arts and the liberation from unexamined assumptions, which is probably the main focus of critical thinking in the course. Think outside the box. It's a cliche. I think it actually comes from this. Okay? So, I don't know if any of you have never seen it before and came up with a solution, but the point of this is that you want to draw the line and you want to stop and draw another line. It seems to be just obvious that you have to stop on a dot. The students all get that, of course, but occasionally, but I try to get them to do the thinking, but eventually someone raises this point of what if we continued? When we talked about critical thinking years ago, I remember there was a student who brought up critical condition, like in the hospital. And at first, we all expect certain answers, and I wasn't expecting that one. But I stopped and I thought, yes, that's exactly it. Because when you're in the critical condition, you don't know what's going to happen. The situation is very unstable, and we're not sure whether the person is going to live or die. And it's the same way when you enter into the real form of critical thinking. The things that you thought you know are put in suspension. The questions are much clearer than the answers. You're looking at things in a shifting perspective, and you're not quite sure where you are, which is, of course, why people didn't like Socrates. Why Meno called him a torpedo fish who made him feel perplexed. So here we are. We've left the safety of the square. We've gone beyond the pale. We're suspended in nothingness. Is that possible? Isn't that somehow against the rules? Well, in fact, it's the only way to solve the problem. We have to draw lines like that. Otherwise, the solution's impossible. So the only way to solve the problem is to think outside the box, as the phrase goes. And I think it really is a nice example for our students to really realize that their own assumptions are what is preventing them from solving the problems. Certainly this problem. Plato is certainly canonical, and rightly so. This idea of questioning assumptions, thinking outside the box, of course, is tied very closely to thinking outside the cave. And so I always try to give the students a thumbnail sketch. Obviously, I spend a lot more time on it than I can here. All of you are familiar with it. The idea that floating in front of these inhabitants of the cave is this kind of image, shadowy image that they think is reality. They can't turn their heads. They see these images and they think that the truth is before them. And in fact, what they would discover, and Plato doesn't tell us why, but someone is able to free himself or herself and make the journey out. And I think that's a key issue. But what they see, first of all, is a fire and a rampart, and of course, the statue of a tree, in this case, casting its shadow on the cave wall. At this point, they might well think that they've found the truth. The nice thing about this is it really does bring in critical thinking issues. It's one of the great things about Plato. He doesn't even mention, he says there are people moving the statues around and making noises. Who are these people? Right? Who are the people in charge of the images that we take to be true? It's an obvious question. Plato doesn't, no one asks him in the Socrates in the Republic to answer that question. But somehow this person isn't satisfied with the light of the cave and the statues that appear to be more solid originals behind the shadows, but they actually make the journey up out of the darkness, through the darkness of the tunnel. Presumably they can lose their way, as Alcibiades did. And finally they make their way to the surface, where they see a real tree illuminated by the light of the sun. And we all know, of course, this is Plato's dreamt of realm of absolute truth, and the good that is beyond being, the source of all knowledge and truth and so on. And it's a wonderful tale. I usually do continue, as Plato continues in the Republic, to talk about what happens when the philosopher comes back down into the cave and he looks like an idiot and no one takes him seriously, and so on. But in terms of the whole question of freedom and liberal arts, this is the story that has to be told. And it is, of course, I think, timeless. In the Meno, which I also always try to spend time on, the focus is instead on how we live, on virtue, and particularly on whether virtue can be taught. The key issue in this is in the center of the dialogue, when Meno is fed up and basically says, look, Socrates invites him to journey with him to find the truth, and he says, no, learning the truth is impossible. How can we find something if we don't know what it is we're looking for? Either you know what it is already, or you would never even recognize it if you tripped over. Meno's paradox. And Socrates responds with the famous theory of recollection. Meno says, prove it to me, and they get into this whole issue with Meno's slave. I focus on this a lot because it's, first of all, an experiential learning opportunity. It's not the way it's presented in the book. Socrates gives the answer to the slave. But if you don't do that, and since the students often haven't read it, we can do it in class together. I did this with my own two children when they were both around 7 or 8, and they figured it out without being told the answer. The problem is, how do we build a square that is twice the area of a 4-foot square? In other words, one that has 8 square feet, or whatever unit in area. And here we have a square that's 2 by 2, it's 4, we want one that's double that size. How do we do it? And so here we have, Meno says, well, what if we double the size? But of course now it's 4 by 4, which is 16, it's twice the size we need. So then the question is, well, how can we solve this problem? What if we cut each of these squares in half? Now I'm obviously providing the answers as well, but you see the point is, if you cut each square in half, and you take half of each square, then we could somehow build the square we're looking for. Yes, I mean, usually the students provide that themselves. But these will never work. These are little rectangles, will never build a square. So then someone comes up with the idea, let's cut it in a different way. Now, Socrates feeds that answer to Meno, but if you don't, and if you're patient enough, people will come up with it themselves. And that's the heart of experiential learning. You don't have to go into the community and help people. You can do it even the process of discovery. This is the Pythagorean theorem in a nutshell. And it is a discovery, not a memorization process. So it's a really nice thing, and you get this answer. We've now built a square which is half of the 4 foot, half of the 16 and twice the 4. Now the question though is, what kind of answer do we have? This is something that doesn't get thematized either, but they crow and he's come up with the answer, but in fact, there is no number that when multiplied by itself gives int. It's not on the ruler, it's not a real number. And that's significant, in my opinion, because although we can build a virtuous life, we may never have the answer to the question, what is virtue? And similarly, there may simply be beyond our reach. It may not fit into the system of rules and rubrics and numbers that we live by. So it's, I think, a very profound point that Plato makes without even drawing attention to it. At the end of all this, Socrates says, I don't want to insist that my answer is right. And of course, he's talking about the theory of recollection. But he says, I will contend at all costs. And remember, he's about to be put on trial for his life. That we will be better men, braver and less idle, if we believe that one must search for the truth in one's life. And again, the students originally just accept this, but if you get them to think about it, what Socrates has just said, we will be better, braver, and less lazy. This is really a definition of virtue. In other words, the secret to virtue is to search for truth. He does give an answer. He just doesn't give it in a way that anyone is really paying attention to. This is the answer to a virtuous life, seeking the truth and questioning. In the same way, Socrates pretends that there's a contradiction in what the poet says. You will learn goodness from the good, versus you will never make a bad man good by teaching. But in fact, the students realize with a little bit of prodding that they're not contradictory. They're talking to 2 different people about 2 very different things. The you in both cases is vastly different. The one is a person who wants to learn goodness. The other is a person who wants to transform someone through some kind of a techne from being a bad person to a good person. Through teaching as opposed to learning. I mean, what Plato says here in 2,400 years ago is a nutshell of what we're trying to do now. Focus less on teaching people and more on giving people an opportunity to learn. That's really what it's about, and that's very much where we're headed. I ask a few questions here. Socrates, why? You know, he says, for example, that if it can be taught, there would be teachers. Since it's not taught, it's impossible that there would ever be teachers, and that's obviously very invalid or unsound. You know, why is Socrates so unsocratic in dealing with the slave? Why does he falsely impute a contradiction to the poet? Why does he conflate possibility with actuality? We're talking about that issue I just touched on. Why does he end the dialogue with something that seems so contradictory, which is to say that virtue is a gift from the gods? If virtue is a gift from the gods, then we will become more idle, less good, and less brave if we think there's nothing we can do to achieve knowledge of virtue, because it's just a gift and it's beyond our understanding. So it is completely contradictory if you think about it, and that's what we encourage our students to do. This is the final word of the dialogue, and I don't really have time to go into that now, but the point is that he sends Meno off to share his discoveries with Anytus, one of the people that are bringing the charges against Socrates. And clearly this implies that even though Meno feels he's gotten nowhere, Socrates really actually is saying, you have achieved something, and you need to go and share that with others. So there has been learning that's gone on in a dialogue that basically problematizes the whole question of learning as such. Is it possible? How does it occur? What does a teacher look like? The answer, of course, is that a teacher looks like Socrates, not a sophist. Anyway, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the canon in concluding, if I may. I think I've just a few minutes, maybe. All right, thank you. Just really quickly, because the question really is, how do we treat these eminent texts? You know, are we reverent, or are we, you know, is it, as I say here, an insurrection? The author's intention, the authorization, the authority of the author. You know, these are things that we certainly can't any longer simply take for granted. When you read Plato in the way that I've just sort of adumbrated, you sort of feel like, oh yeah, I see this contradiction here. I mean, one reaction would be to say that Plato's an idiot. And it's probably not likely, right? He probably did that on purpose. And the deeper you dig into the text, you get the feeling that he's sitting there looking, waiting for you to arrive and smiling and saying, oh, you finally got to this level. And that's that sense of genius that we do want to revere. I feel the same way with Shakespeare. There's certainly other people in the history of the canon that you feel that way. I don't feel that way as much with Descartes, but I think that's the question. So with Descartes, I just wanted to really quote quickly through the fact that he's a little more problematic. I mean, for example, here I talk about how he inverts the tree of knowledge. The roots of Descartes' philosophy is metaphysics, whereas in the Aristotelian conception, they were the fruits. That was the highest thing one could do, was to contemplate the nature of God. Why does Descartes do this? He does it because for him, the fruits are the practical benefits. What Descartes is guided by is something that we all know very well, which is the practical benefits of living a long and comfortable life and becoming the masters and possessors of nature. And now philosophy is very much in service to these very base instincts of dominance and comfort and pleasure. He needs to be careful, but I think he's really more of a scientist than anything else. And in the second meditation, I find the key thing is the introduction of the piece of wax, which essentially says, we need to look at the world not the way we commonly do, but the way a scientist has to. Abstractly, in terms of abstract qualities. In other words, when we see a tree, we see nice red apples, maybe we're hungry. When Newton sat under the tree, reading Descartes, as you'll see in the next slide, right? I found this diagram and I've played around with it, but I thought this was great because there's Newton reading Descartes. Descartes was his teacher. He taught him when the apple fell, it wasn't a nice juicy red apple, it wasn't who threw that, it was rather an object possessing mass and acceleration. Purely abstract quantities. I don't look at apples that way, but if you want to be a scientist, that's how you have to see things. It's a shift in how we see the world that we have to be very aware of. And that was really Descartes' major contribution. And I think that, again, goes over very well with the students. So, in a sense, by looking at Descartes contrary to his intention in terms of what he's doing as a part of a middle-class revolution. 150 years before the French Revolution, he was already changing the way we look at the world in the direction of that would culminate in the French Revolution, in the direction that culminates in the scientific revolution. But it's not necessarily what he thinks he's doing, or isn't. But we start to become suspicious in our hermeneutics. And of course, that leads to looking at the end of the course at someone like Nietzsche. When Nietzsche looks back at Plato, he sees things very differently than what Plato had in mind. When Nietzsche looks at philosophy, as in this first quote, he says, we don't need to revere the system. We need to take it apart and see what we can build with the blocks, really with the rubble. Right? So Nietzsche's already anticipating a kind of deconstructive reading. So yes, I teach Nietzsche to freshmen, and they actually like it. I mean, it actually does connect with them quite well, and it's difficult, but again, we don't read too much. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into too much of this, but in the case of Plato, right, he talks about Plato again and again, but it's often the sense of Plato having to create this ideal realm, and it really, you know, if you start criticizing Plato, you're going to have the students readily agree, because the idea of absolute standards is so foreign to them. But if you take it seriously and try to actually convince them that Plato's right, and then come around at the end of the course and give them a critic like Nietzsche, it really works very well. All right, well, again, Nietzsche has his own tree. I don't have time, but it's a rhizome. To just end with the question of the canon. Well, I mentioned here the rhizome, but we need to rethink the eminence of these texts, it seems to me. We need to move towards something that, I mean, first of all, starting as Derrida himself started, and Derrida came to Cairo, as Ariel remembers, and the room was so packed that I literally sat at his feet, and that was really moving to me. And what he said is that you have to read, and you have to read with care and meticulousness and attention to what the author intends, which is what people don't expect from Derrida. But then Derrida, of course, goes on and says we also have to be aware of what is occluded, what is marginalized, what is left out. We have to read in a very a way that allows for the non-hierarchical, the decentered, and the impure. We have to basically bring the canon down from the heights, as it were, and engage it in context, in tradition, and basically make it, as we say, relevant for a new generation of thinkers and readers. So with that, I will say thank you.
Let's say 10 minutes for questions before we begin the panel. So does anybody like to address Richard?
A kind of basic question with the curriculum. You're talking of the freshman program, but I mean, in order to put us on the same level, for us freshmen, not everybody comes in and has to do the freshman year. The freshman is for those people who haven't taken that back and so have to take courses in order to get the equivalence of the back, right? So that means that however much we want to introduce a course about mathematical thinking or anything like that, we are restricted because we have to satisfy a government requirement. We can't just invent courses for people coming from a high school environment into a university. We're forced in the freshman year to give a kind of school education. And that is a disaster. Sorry, but...
Well, we have a sort of similar situation in our, we have a French program, which is pre-freshman for us, but we do have to get through certain content, particularly, as I said, academic English. But what we've repackaged that as is a academic English for the liberal arts. And so we're already, in a sense, trying to bring in some of the liberal arts elements and some of the study skills elements. And an experiment that we're using, which has proven very successful, is to have a model called adjuncting, where the students at our pre-freshman level, in the bridge program, also are sitting in classes like the seminar 1023 actually that I mentioned, where they're reading Gilgamesh, which is well above their level. But because the class they're taking in intensive English is aware that they're in that class, so they actually work together. They're not tutoring them, they're not helping them do the class, but they're providing English and activities that reinforce and that work to support the class. And the students find it really successful, because again, it's relevant to them. So anyway, I didn't understand, and I'm still a little bit unclear about your situation as regards to the freshmen, and if I'd known, I might not have focused so much on what we do with freshmen, because apparently it doesn't apply here. So, but I'll try to learn more about that.
Could you say a bit about how your course, philosophical thinking, how the philosophical thinking course would actually kind of bring down the canon from the heights? I mean, it sounds like a wonderful course, and I'm not asking the question from the assumption that you don't, but just how do you think about it?
Right. Well, I think that the three authors that I tend to use, and of course other people don't necessarily follow exactly the same thing, although we do all start with Plato, and most of us do something like Descartes, if not. Generally, we do Descartes, but sometimes people do Hume and people like that. But I think the point is that the books we're using would certainly tend to look very, very canonical. And of course, in philosophy, I mean, that really does make sense. I think that's certainly the approach that all of us that teach in the program feel very comfortable with. It seems absolutely right. We do a close reading. We are very, in a sense, reverent to the texts. But as I tried to show, when you dig into Plato, you see in Plato himself, the way that he structured it, the character of Socrates is definitely, you sort of warts and all. And you see, again, I think it's very deliberate, right? You get angry. You say, if only I'd been there, I wouldn't have let Socrates get away with that. He brings you into, and that's very canonical. That's very much the reverence that we expect. But as I said, when I worked with the students through Descartes, someone that they feel much more comfortable with, he's not 2,400 years out of date, he's only 400 years old, he's one of us, he's a modern. So the students recognize in him a bit more of a kindred spirit. And so to start to really critically think about what he's doing, to critically think about the assumptions that he's making, to look, for example, at the rhetorical exercise of the letters to the doctors of the Sorbonne. I mean, it's a brilliant piece of writing, but the students also begin to see what he's saying. And it's, so we're being a little more critical. And then when you look at Nietzsche, Nietzsche is, what I'm essentially saying about Nietzsche is that he is a canonical figure that is the beginning of a kind of deconstruction of the canon, right? Where he is someone, I mean, he says, who is this I that thinks that Descartes talks about, right? I mean, that's a very profound question, and it's one that's very difficult for the students to even get their heads around. But those kinds of issues, one of the examples that works really well, that fits with this, there's actually two that come to mind, that are very much kind of Nietzschean, and the students completely understand. One of them is the question of beauty, right? That, we talk about Titian or some of these artists from centuries ago. Did they just have bad taste in women? No, no. What is really the issue here? And what the students quickly realize is that those pale, overweight ladies embody wealth and privilege, just as the thin, tanned, super fit ladies of today do. If you have money now, you're out getting fit. And if you don't, you're sitting in an office eating McDonald's. And in those days, it was the opposite. If you had no money, you were out in the field, you were tanned, you were fit, and you were poor. So, and you were starving, but I'll leave that aside. So the issue, that's a really classic example of how there's no Platonic standard of beauty, but it functions within a system of power and knowledge. And in the same way, we also talk about Nietzsche's analysis of pity, where you're foisting an interpretation on someone saying, oh, you feel sorry for yourself and so on, and you're in a position of superiority and power and so on. And these kinds of analysis, as I said, the hermeneutics of suspicion is really what Nietzsche embodies, and it leads then to a view of these canonical texts that starts to undermine this reverence that we naturally bring to them. It doesn't devalue them, but it does tend to bring them down into the situation where, as I said, they're much more contextualized and much more a question of what can we do with these, and that's Nietzsche's point about rebuilding from the rubble. It's not a question of destroying, but it's a question of trying to sort of see through what's going on to what's underlining, what's motivating what we're seeing, what has been included, what has been marginalized, what is the the supplement that's necessarily there, the unsaid. Derrida's example that you can't have writing without the empty page, that that which is silenced is necessary for there to be any speaking at all. And in the same way, that's essentially what we're trying to identify. And so, again, it's a lot to ask for freshman students to really start to understand this. But I actually find that because perhaps this is in the culture today, they actually do take to this relatively well. But having been reverent towards Plato, I think the thing I'm trying to stress is that you don't want a one-sided thing. I don't want to have a course that is simply saying, we can learn nothing from these dead white people. We can learn a lot from them, and we need to be aware of them. But at the same time, we don't need to be uncritical disciples that accept everything they say without any kind of self-reflection and any kind of sense of how this actually worked. And as I said, for Descartes, what Descartes gave birth to is the situation that we face today, the situation where, as Nietzsche said, right, we're dying from our comfortableness, where the world has become flat and without any kind of struggle. And this is thanks to Descartes' fixation on the benefits of engineering, mechanics, and medicine to create a long and comfortable life. It seemed obvious to him, but in fact, maybe we need to go back to the Greeks. But anyway, I won't go on anymore.
Hi, thank you very much. I have a bunch of questions. I'll try to restrict them to two, one wearing my philosophy hat, and one wearing my administrator hat. The philosophy hat question is just sort of curricular. I find it odd to teach Nietzsche, who's criticizing the whole history of philosophy, right after teaching only two figures, because it seems that they're not getting what he's criticizing, right? So you've got Plato, you've got Descartes, you've got everything else that happened between, and you've got everything that happens between Descartes and Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's criticizing all of that. And so I'm not sure how they would get a sense of what it is he's critiquing just by reading these two figures. So that's my philosophy hat. My administrator hat is a very simple question, which is about the advisors. Who are the advisors at the AUC? Because we have a system where the faculty members are the advisors, and if it's not faculty members, does it work well? Because again, there's a discussion of shifting the system there.
Well, on the first question, I mean, to some degree, of course, you're right. I mentioned that I introduced Descartes with a quick reading of passages from Al-Ghazali's Deliverance from Error. And in, of course, doing that, I try to introduce a little bit, I have a lecture where and it really is a lecture, but I start by saying, okay, in the next 45 minutes, we're going to cover 2,000 years, So, but I do try to give some sense that there is something that happened between Plato and Descartes, and so on. So, but obviously, yes, you're right. But on the other hand, if you look at Nietzsche, Plato, he's obsessed with Plato and Socrates. So a great deal of what he says is, if you have some idea of Plato, then you can really understand a lot of the critique of the tradition, because he focuses a lot on Plato. And then he also has a great deal to say about Descartes, and we focus on it. And the other thing, of course, is simply, again, I put a lot of emphasis not only on how Descartes was part of a middle-class revolution, but that Nietzsche was writing in a period in which the 20th century was about to dawn, and in fact, when he became read was after World War I, and try to situate the culture so that it's not just Nietzsche complaining about past historical figures, but really a historical process where the things that were taken for granted and accepted, the supremacy, the white man's burden, for example, is suddenly, for Europeans, all of those values that they exported so happily to the world, crumbled to dust. And Nietzsche anticipated that kind of collapse of values. So, I think it can work, and it does work, but obviously, and if it invites students to learn more, then I think that's a part of the hoped-for result as well. On the other issue, yes, we have a set of professional advisors. They tend to be AUC graduates, which means that they understand the system fairly well. The fact that they're part of my office, I think, is very helpful. We really do sort of work with them to make sure that the tendency for advisors like that is to treat the students like clients and essentially try to give the students what it is that they want. I tell the advisors that they're teachers, and as such, it's not about giving people what they think they want, but helping them to question what it is they think they want, and you know, to think again. And that actually resonates very well with them. So rather than giving the students the easy way, or don't take that course, it's too hard, the advisors have started to really understand the liberal arts idea and to be able to sell students on the freshman program and the core and things like that. So, and as you said, I mean, faculty advising, what we're moving towards in the majors is having more faculty play the role of mentors and have more professional staff advisors, because they know the technical details much better than the faculty ever will, but they don't know the major and the field and where this all ends up, and that's where a mentor really should come in. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Could you tell us a little bit more about how the texts were selected for the 2015 iteration of the core class, which you gave us an example of, which I think was around the theme of art, literature, and theater, particularly given that Egypt, Cairo, the Middle East has a very long history and a rich one of sort of all three of those things, but very few of those examples were actually in the text.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that, I mean, it to some degree has always been in the seminar, that there was an effort to have, like a novel that was relevant. You know, you may have seen that in the earlier version. Here there's the Mahfouz stories. The title of the course is theater. In the particular syllabus that I happened to find, there was no theater. I think that it's a very interesting question. I mean, the course is run by a committee of the people that teach in it, and there's a coordinator. And it's interestingly the same person who's been coordinating it for the last 2 decades, and so has seen all the changes that have happened. And I think that he has a very strong commitment to the basic great books idea. But in terms of, yeah, I didn't actually mention this, but I think in terms of the general education core curriculum in general, there has been a movement, and in fact, Catholic University had a meeting, and they was trying to take a leadership role in setting up a kind of MENA consortium on general education in the core, but trying to find a kind of Arab regional rootedness in it, which I think is really important. I think that I personally don't think it's a foreign implant. I mean, if you look at someone like Al-Ghazali, he's very much a person that understands the central themes of the liberal education, liberal arts. On the other hand, of course, right after he died, his books were burned. So, you know, some of his free thinking was not appreciated, to say the least. But he famously says that if you don't doubt, if you don't question, you will never really come to knowledge. So yeah, I mean, I definitely think that some of the other courses that I showed you, I think, have a much stronger connection to the indigenous culture, to the theater, to the literature of Egypt and so on. I think it's an important part of what we do. Whether or not it could be beefed up, I think you're right. Good.
Thanks a lot for this talk. I actually wanted to ask just briefly about the dual capstone course. And you mentioned economics hasn't developed one. Is there somebody who has developed one that you see as an interesting model you just talk about briefly? Thanks.
Yeah, there have been quite a few that I think have taken off. Let me see if I can think of a particularly strong one. There's one that has just been developed by our graduate school of education, because they've been encouraged to teach undergraduates, and it's focused around the theme of lifelong learning, and essentially it's around the theme of education, where you don't. They make sure that the reading material and so on is, as I said, at a very high level, but it doesn't require the professional background. The history department has been very good at developing them, because again, there is certainly a craft and a tradition of historiography that you develop. They have their own capstone in the major, which requires a good level of achievement, but they also have courses that are very much open to others. We have not yet found the sort of ideal interdisciplinary course that we dream of. There is a course that is focused on sort of, the question of the self, and it works fairly well, but I'm not sure that we haven't quite got what we wanted to. I have to say something, which is that I taught an advanced seminar on Heidegger's Being in Time, and it was for our majors, and it really was very advanced. turns out that students were able to get into it to fulfill the capstone. And I don't know how they got in there, but I discovered they were there. These were like accounting majors. And so it was really quite a challenge to teach to the serious philosophy majors and to the accounting majors, and teaching Heidegger's Being in Time. In the end, they actually kind of enjoyed it, but see that we didn't have enough courses in those days, so it was an error on their part. So there are courses that can be designed to be accessible, and there are other courses within every major that really are not. And that's really been the challenge. So, you know, I think so far it's working, but the real goal has not yet been achieved, even 4 years in.
One more question, I think there was one in the back.
Just a question on actually the way you evaluate students. Which methods seem to work the best for you? We're in a program now, for example, where we're integrating in some of our courses research component, where students have to work on a certain topic and they're evaluated for this. I'm thinking also, is there some way to evaluate perhaps even collaborative work of different students? Just curious about which ways you do this, especially with the philosophy course.
The philosophy course, I co-taught it a year ago, but other than that, I have gone away from it over the last few years. But I think that my colleagues are still using a pretty straightforward, you know, they tend towards using the straightforward method of having a paper. One of the things that we say, though, is that in this course, we're not focused on research, we're focused on your own encounter with the text. And that's, again, something that students find very difficult, but it makes it, what I often do is actually give them a passage, because that way they can't download a generic essay on Nietzsche or Descartes. They have to really focus on a particular passage. And so there is one of my colleagues in philosophy who is much more innovative in terms of this, and he does actually, he has presentations, he has collaborative work, you know, he's doing things that all of us think we should do, but at least when I was teaching, I had barely begun, and I'm not sure how many of my colleagues are. In other core courses, we're definitely pursuing more interesting methods of grading and assigning grades. And the capstone courses all have an oral presentation, they all have a teamwork learning outcome and requirement. And one of the things that we really want to work towards, as I mentioned, is the idea of an e-portfolio. And the main purpose of an e-portfolio is the student's own reflective process. But once the culture gets established, you have an amazing tool not only for assessing student learning, but also for assessing the effectiveness of your program. I mean, as you all know, to assess the core curriculum is really, really difficult because it's very diffuse, it's taught in, you know, some students in a particular history course may be there for core credit, others are history majors. So it's a very difficult thing to do, but if you get the students themselves to reflect on their learning over a course of several years in an e-portfolio, then not only do you have them gain from that, but you also have a way of assessing the effectiveness of the program. So this is something that we really hope will take off. And again, starting with the freshmen has worked very well. Our hope is that the students themselves will take to these things, and as they move on into the majors and into the upper reaches of the core, they're going to actually expect it. Rather than us trying to convince the faculty to adopt something, we're hoping the students will do the convincing. We'll see.
Could you briefly tell us what an e-portfolio is?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, of course, a portfolio is just a big binder that you collect things in, like an art student that carries around this big container of all their work. So an e-portfolio is essentially the same idea. You upload artifacts, and if you're an architect student, of course, they may be designs. If you're a photography and theater student, you know, they might be videos. But if you're a philosophy student, they could be essays and papers. They could be recordings of a presentation as well. But the key thing is that there is an element in which you organize this material. And of course, you can use it to collect absolutely everything you do, but the end result is something that has been selected and edited and organized. And the goal is to have a sort of a product that you can hand into a faculty member for a grade, that you can hand into the university at the end when you're graduating, and that ultimately in some form you can also use when you're applying for work, so that this is a collection of your achievements. Rather than simply show someone a transcript where I took this course and I got a grade, you can actually say, this is what I did, this is the work that I produced. You know, if you're a journalism student, obviously, right? These are the articles that I wrote. And this is what I got out of it. So, you know, the goal is really for the students to take an active role in connecting the different courses they take, and putting their work together in a coherent way, and then presenting it to, you can use the same platform to present it to different audiences. And it can be a private thing as well as a public thing. So it's a very powerful tool that has a lot of potential uses. It's a lot of work to set up, but once you have it set up, it's dead easy, the students tell me. So.
All right, so we really don't have any more time. We're about 20 minutes over with this, so we've indulged ourselves as far as we really should, and beyond, I imagine. So I would ask, I believe, Frank, Nadia, Ira, Janine, and Tamara to come up and join the discussion panel for their consideration of Canon, Civilisation, and the format is an internal discussion, which will be opened up at some point to
Microphone.
the microphone. Okay.
So we're going to start having an internal discussion. Dahlia, what portion of our hour should we use for that? As we feel fit.
As
so
we feel fit, allowing just some time for everybody else to get involved.
All right. So we'll try to maybe start with a half-half notion and see how the internal discussion runs over. So I'm going to ask everybody to introduce themselves rather than having me do it. So would you like to start?
No more.
Sure. Oh, Ash, please.
Is there a secondary bring to the table?
Frank Darwish, I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Beirut in northern Lebanon.
Your interest?
Oh, yes, I did my PhD in France, so a lot of my education is French, and I'm a Heidegger specialist, actually. So I do a bit of German as well, and I'm interested in questions of the divine and aesthetics as well, and some side issues like philosophy of science.
Nadia Speiti, I'm Assistant Professor of Middle East Studies here at AUB. I'm trained as a historian of the modern Middle East with a focus on Lebanon, education, gender issues during the Mandate period.
Hello, my name is Tamer Amin, and I teach in the education department. I direct the Science and Mathematics Education Center. My research interests are in learning science, specifically learning scientific concepts, and how that relates to language, the language of science, and how the language of a learner before developing expertise interacts with learning scientific concepts.
I guess I don't have to reintroduce myself.
Just one on each side.
Hi, I'm Janine Abushi. I teach at LAU, the Lebanese American University up the way. And I teach comparative literature and cultural studies and creative writing. And I'm busy disowning my expertise.
My name is Ira Allen. I'm an assistant professor of rhetoric and composition here at AUB. I'm a rhetorical and political theorist, German-English translator, and a writing specialist, so I also direct the Writing Center here.
Is that working?
Yeah. My name's Eric, also history of political theory and social and political thought. I'm with CVSP and jointly with political science and public administration at AUB. My background is Hegel, non-Western political thinking, history of political thought, ancient, modern, medieval. So with that, I guess we'll jump into a discussion on issues of canon, civilization, and critical thought. Rather than doing it one question at a time, and actually let's leave it open. If some of you have questions you'd like to bring into the discussion for the internal panel, I'll take hands during the process so that if people want to get us to inspire the conversation with further questions, we'll bring those in, and later on, afterwards, we'll open the discussion up to everybody. But to start, we're going to start it at the table here. So I'm going to open up with 3 questions on the issue of canon. What is a canon? What shapes a canon? And what type of authority, coherence, or shape does a canon have? Second question, I'm going to send out a cluster of questions that we can just deal with here. What makes a classic or a great book? And how are these reproduced across space and time and in the act of reading itself. The third one comes from Janine, which was, how about life without canons? What does life look like? What might life be without canons altogether? So having thrown those cluster of questions out, I'll look for commentators. Great.
I suppose we could just answer any of the three.
As you like, of
Yeah,
course.
there's no specific order. I think perhaps what makes a text, rather use the word classic, so the second question, so important and something that we need is the fact that it's something that we always have to go back to. And it's something that we always have to go back to because of the questioning that is present in it. In other words, I would think mostly what makes the text very important is that it disturbs us. And it not only did it at a certain point in time, I think it's a text that continues to disturb us. And every time we go to it, it even can disturb us in a different way, depending on the time period that we're living in, depending on the issues that are present for us. Every time we go back to such a text, there is a very important questioning, and it makes our lives not only much more interesting, but it makes our lives, if we go back again to Socrates, worth living, I think. And that's what really makes a classical text.
I was just noticing when we were talking the statesman-like language around the question of core curriculum and also the canon. And I made a mistake when I wrote down some remarks and I put canons. And I kind of like that, you know, this sort of war rhetoric. But we talk about defending, promoting, we talk about donors, we said the word indoctrinate, we talk about moral values. This is very statesman-like language when we're talking about the core curriculum. We don't necessarily make these points positively, but this language is seeping in from the side. And canon, you know, the canon, masterpieces, great books, and then we have new-fangled words for it, eminent books, significant books, sort of euphemisms for the same thing, a version of the same thing, as if there's, I find the reason why I suggest what if we live without, what about life after, with no canon, in the core curriculum, and I very much like the philosophy and the effect and the idea of liberal arts education, going very far away from your specialty. I like that, so I'm not blowing that up, but I'm wondering about not having a canon, and there's a way in which we are perpetuating a list of books. I mean, in the 80s we blew up the canon, we added books, or we added texts, we added the grades, but we haven't actually thought, what if we don't have a list? One thing, and I really appreciate your comment about this, is that we would lose money, or Columbia would lose money. You need the list of books. But there's a problem, I find it problematic that institutions should perpetuate a relationship between, you know, great works, and you can have, like, sprinkle a few from the East, a bunch of them from the West, and put them together in a kind of artificial way. So I was thinking about when the last time I taught very canonical works, and it was in a sort of a comparative world literature course, and it was the Mahabharata, it was the Canterbury Tales, and it was 1001 Nights, and it was Don Quixote, selections from these works, but mainly the afterlives of these works, in music, in you know, some popular culture, why, you know, so that you get to ask what perpetuates it, beside the universities putting them in their curricula, what perpetuates these? Why do they travel, these texts, these works, in between genres and cultures. And what you end up getting are contexts that our canon lists leave out. We get context back. So we see Peter Brook going to India to produce a 9-hour play produced in London. But he goes to India, and everyone working on this project of the Mahabharata, they go to India, they read a lot, they live a lot, they spend a lot of time. It's an engagement. So this interests me. It's quite fascinating. So it's a question of how these works survived and in so many odd, eccentric forms and projects in different languages and cultures. So that would not quite be a canon, really, in the sense that we're using it. It's like this abstract list, teach this.
Thank you. I want to try and follow that question, or that response, by speaking to all three pieces, or all three questions, through the capital C, capital G, capital B, classic and great books paradigm. So and specifically, I want to think a little bit about where we get the word a classic. What does it mean for something to be a classic? Why is something a classic? Why that word specifically, and not, why not necessarily just significant text, eminent text, great books, etc.? Why does classic ring so much more broadly in the popular imagination? Not just in the way that we construct things in the academy, but that's a classic. It's a classic of world literature. It's the name of a bunch of different series by a bunch of different publishing houses, classics in X. And it has something to do with the idea of a classical, with some discontinuous past that we nominate, and by nominating, define ourselves as simultaneously both against and, in some sense, continuations of. So I think what's interesting about the word classical and then the word the classics is that there are ways of inventing origins for ourselves. And so in a sense, when we think about canons as collections of classic works, I'm untroubled by the fact that we have something like canonicity. We will have something like canonicity. We're a kind of species, we're a symbolic animal that's helplessly always in the process of inventing origins for ourselves. What's interesting then is how and why we invent the kinds of origins that we do. What makes it possible or impossible to include a 9-hour performance as a key component of a canon? And I don't think that it is impossible, but I'm saying what are the conditions of impossibility and possibility? So like for me, then the question of the classics is itself something that we should be constantly negotiating with our own students. We're putting forward the question of why we count certain things as classic in some contexts, under some conditions, why we don't count other things as classic, what it means to count things as classic, the unavoidability of taking something to be our source, something that's discontinuous with us. And I want to kind of stress the idea of discontinuity. So you're familiar with the phrase, a modern classic. Something can become a modern classic. And we have the phrase because classic means not modern. We have we have actually, interestingly, a long series of disputes between the moderns and the ancients in a variety of different domains where different groups of people are purporting to be more faithful to some ancients or conversely more properly modern. And so this is, it's actually one of these kind of trends within the kind of animal that we are, within the social groups that we form, to come up with some discontinuous past that some of us claim to be more faithful to, and some present that others of us claim to be better or superior to that discontinuous past and its up-to-the-moment continuation. So I think what's interesting then with the idea of the classics is the way that it offers us a chance to directly negotiate, not just among ourselves, not just at the level of curriculum development, but with our students, how and why canonicity happens. Like I said, I'm untroubled by the fact that we'll have canons. We can't not have collections of things that agglomerate over time. We're institutions. That's what institutions are. we have agglomerated collections of things, all kinds of things. Stupid things, smart things, good things, bad things, we agglomerate. But how we agglomerate and why we agglomerate, if that's not open for discussion, the very idea of a liberal arts education and the very idea of critical thinking falls away. And so I think part of then, to me, what's at stake is not necessarily trying to work for a life without canons, but also I agree, not necessarily just coming up with a better canon, that now we have the better canon, right? Now we have not just this list of white men, we've got Virginia Woolf in there, thank goodness. Mary Wollstonecraft made the list. Good, thank goodness. We've improved the canon. Rather, helping our students to think about how and why a need for origins traces itself textually seems to me to be one of the most critical things that we can be doing. Thanks.
Okay, I think I'd like to sort of add a dimension to the discussion from the point of view of sort of the notion of culture or community. I think that from my point of view, the question of whether one should say there is a canon or there is not, or what one should select as the canon, for me is not really the question if the issue is a liberal education in a modern university in this part of the world or elsewhere. For me, ultimately, and I think inevitably, implicitly in the conversation, there is the assumption that we're talking about our canon or our preferred conception of a canon, etc. So then I think the question then comes back on us as individuals within a community that may consider ourselves part of or not some kind of homogeneous or heterogeneous culture. So if you think of the university, so we're saying, at some point early on in your talk, you talked about an introduction or bringing the students into a culture. Okay, so what is that culture? Do we, as a community of faculty within a university or a set of universities, do we share it? When we each of us sit down to say not what is the canon or what we consider. I mean, I can imagine that some people, if asked that question, oppressed by the issue, by the would actually put down texts in what they consider to be the canon that they haven't themselves read, right? So why should it be included in the list just because from some distant perspective or some distant community that has had a role to play in your consciousness, you decide to put it down as a canon. So for me, what I think is ultimately important, especially from a pedagogical point of view, is that what we are teaching and the books that we are giving our students to read, and we are saying these are worth reading, are things that we have considered ourselves have been worth reading for us. And so that'll go back to who we are. I mean, what our disciplines are, what our histories are, and also there's a relational issue. I mean, what I consider this to be important for you, because I know something about who you are as a student, where you've come from, where you live, where you've been living, what sort of transition is going on with you as you come from high school to this particular university in this city. I think this would be interesting to read. So I think when we put it that way, different kinds of issues come up. We ask ourselves who the students are, what are the issues that they're engaged in, what are the issues that we're engaged in, and we would like them to kind of know about them. What conversation are we having that they are entering into? So I think for me that's an important framing of the issue. The result, when I look sort of more practically, for example, at how AUB approaches this issue, very few, in contrast, I was a graduate of AUC in '91, and I just missed out on the seminar
and when I heard about it, I wish I would have participated. But one of the things I liked so much about the concept of that seminar, at least is how it was being taught there, is the faculty from different fields were teaching. So you had physicists teaching it, sociologists, economists, etc. And they all taught all of those books, you know, that range from the scientific to the humanities, the social sciences. And so I felt that, reflecting on it now, I didn't think about it like that then, but you know, reflecting on it now, to me that kind of is a nice example of a culture, or a meeting point between students and a culture, because the faculty are saying, okay, these are important books to us. Now whether they played a role in selecting them, you know, one can rethink that process. But if you are if you're limiting the people who are necessarily seen as the repository of the, you know, the source of the selection and the means of delivery to a very narrow subset, which tends to be the humanities in the way that often these courses are conceived. I think that that sort of really limits the scope of what we consider to be that broader culture or community within which we want to welcome students, rather than doctrine.
Anything to follow up on Contra or not?
Tamara mentioned a lot of the thought. I had sort of written a whole bunch of things, but clearly that's not necessary given the format. You did great. I second a lot of what you said and the approach. One of the things that I found so interesting as I was thinking through this, preparing for today, was so before I came to AUB a little over a year ago, I had taught at two sort of elite liberal arts colleges in New England. And one of the things that I find so interesting is that, at least for the most part in the US, the liberal arts colleges are very much moving away from a core curriculum and more towards an open curriculum, where there isn't a set of requirements, where there isn't this idea of a canon. And there certainly isn't the idea of a transdisciplinary canon. And so I sort of want to throw that out there, because I think that's very much the assumption that we've all been operating under, that there's a whole list of texts that physicists and people in education and historians and anthropologists and political scientists will all sort of find useful in terms of creating some sort of universal idea of critical thinking, which is, I know, one of our later questions that we might be asked. So I am a little bit, I want to push back against that. And also return to the title of the workshop today, which is the liberal arts in the modern university, as opposed to the liberal arts college. And I want us to think about the sort of place and the way that liberal arts is being considered and reconfigured within a university setting, which seems to be very different than the way that it's being sort of marginalized in a way from the within liberal arts colleges, sort of writ large. Not just in New England, but all through the US. And then I want to come back to the point that I was trying to make with my question to you, Dr. Switzer, which is thinking through, and which I think you were also alluding to, Tamara, which is thinking through some kind of selection of texts that is specific to the place as institutionally, but also locally, regionally, nationally, internationally, that we are located in. We're not, you know, we're not Yale, we're not Smith, we're not AUC, in spite of our shared sisterliness. So what is it about being at AUB in Lebanon, in this moment, in this region, that can allow us to build and rebuild some kind of set of texts, you know, whether for a specific discipline or transdiscipline, that allows us to draw on intellectual histories that we are inheriting, as well as genealogies of knowledge that we are inheriting, and that are oftentimes sort of marginalized or just written out of this entire picture. I'm not resolving anything, but these things are troubling to me, I think.
I'm up in the track. To just respond to a number of things. I very much like your point about the texts being defined in terms of the questions that they raised, and I think you said that they're troubling. And then you just ended with the word trouble. And it seems to me that we should be troubled. I think part of the issue of what, in the traditional sense, I think the canon was meant to embody identity. I think now we are troubled with the idea of identity, right? And rightly so. I think, as I mentioned, Nietzsche asked the question, you know, who is this I who thinks it's not by any means obvious that there has to be, for every action, a subject that underlies it. There has to be a single, uniform, substantial identity. And in a way, it's a desperate effort to try to identify it. I was thinking about the inevitability of canons. When you were talking about this issue, my friends and I all grew up in the basement listening to rock and roll music, or rock music. And even today, I mean, they're sending emails back and forth with like their top 10 lists. And none of the titles go past 1983. It's like, right? But there's this desperate urge to codify and to collect and agglomerate and do this. It's human nature. It isn't just institutions. But at the same time, I think it's troubling, and I think that I mean, certainly in philosophy, it would be hard to imagine not having what we now have, which is texts above texts. That we do the work that we do by digging into these troubling texts and commenting and deconstructing and building from them and tearing them down and so on. I think to some extent we collect these texts because we do feel that to try to ignore this baggage that we've inherited would be like trying to speak without using the language that we should. I mean, we do, as I mentioned in my syllabus, the words that we use are embedded in history, the ideas that we have out of history, we have to be aware of it. But at the same time, I don't think we need to be prisoners of it. And the worst kind of prisoner is one who falls in love with their captor and reveres this without question. So I personally think that the word you're going to do with is exactly right. I don't think we can ever live without the urge to collect the greatest hits and the best songs and the classics. But at the same time, I think that what we need to walk away with is a sense that we're troubling and we're troubled and we want to encourage our students to be as well troubled. And in fact, in a way, I definitely go back to your definition. What is really draws us back to certain texts is that they're not exhausted. They're potentially inexhaustible, but there's a sense in which we go back to them the way you go back to a well that doesn't run dry, and it continues to captivate us. And those works continue to appear, but it is very hard sometimes to identify them in the vast output of the present era, and things do settle down. I always point out to my students that the one movie that I know they've all seen is Coppola's Godfather. And I said, well, that was a movie that was a classic the moment it appeared. And then I'll mention some other movies that they've seen. And I said, well, for example, the Shawshank Redemption. People love that movie. It was a nothing. It totally disappeared. Things settle out in weird ways over time. And it's also, of course, weird when particular groups of students will identify as classics. So that's another issue. But anyways, all right, I'm going on. I think I lost my point. I wanted to end with the word troubling. I'll give you the microphone. Oh, okay.
I was thinking of adding yet another dimension to that, and it comes from my experience, my current experience, which is being on the committee that's reworking the philosophy programs for Terminal, for last year of secondary school. And so you can imagine the conflict and the problems we're encountering. You'll appreciate that very much. And what happened is we said, well, there's now a question about putting new works. Apart from the fact that we don't want students who are coming to university to not have any critical thinking, we're introducing critical thinking into their philosophy year, the last year, and the year before the last as well. And so we sat down and we said we should we need new authors, especially as concerns Arabic language thinking. And so we sat down, we're about 10, 15 people, and we need something new. Silence. We don't know what to do. Okay. When we are really outside, okay, so little by little, we have Farah Antoun, we have Muhammad Abd Jal, we start to have some names, but the names we have are, once again, some of the people who are rather known in the end. All right, we didn't have them before in the program, but they have, as you said, a presence in our culture, a presence in the way our history has developed, a presence in the way we met certain challenges, a presence in the way we entered conflict and started to hate each other. We need to put also these guys, of course we thought also of Shab Malik, we thought other people. In other words, we have also canons because we're afraid of emptiness. We don't want to just be there without anything. Why? Because then we cannot fight over anything. We need, not necessarily physically, of course, we need conflict. We need to be like Heraclitus. If we are to be, we need to have certain opposites working against each other and producing, perhaps dialectically, something new. That's why I also said every important text should be a troubling text. And it should be a text that puts you into conflict with how your world is, with how you conceive things, with how you read, with how you understand, with how each word in your language has a history. And it's a history of conflicts. Once again, this is what the concept is. The concept is problematic. So we have to still keep certain figures. We cannot be in emptiness and just create a new program for a coming generation. No, we are not an empty space because we are not without history. The human is geschichtlich. The human has a history. It's historial, not just historique, right? Geschichtlich, not just a question of history. So because of that, we have to look what's inside our being as historical beings. And inside our beings as historical beings, there are texts. And these are the texts that we have to go to and question. Question, because we are questioning the origin. As you said, the origin is also with us. It's not just something we keep breaking and breaking and breaking and choosing this origin and that origin. Origin has something of that, but it also has something very continuous, something very insidious. And we don't see it unless we question foundational texts and go to them as questions posed to our history, to our culture, to the way we look at other people and ourselves. And this is a big challenge for us now, for the young people coming to university. How can we teach them to not just learn texts as foundational, but see them as sort of centers of conflict and of production of some new knowledge for a future.
Eric, you said you were going to ask
Richard,
some questions. Does it really matter what you choose as a text, given that the focus is on deep reading of whatever it is?
Are we free to be exegetically creative about our choices of other texts that we
because
spend our time?
as soon as you get into the question of content, of Plato or whoever it is, you get into, is it the West or something else? Whereas what in fact you're doing in the classroom is to teach the student how to get as much as they can out of whatever it is.
I'm not so sure that we need to agglomerate and make selections and lists of texts that, on any basis, texts that were meaningful to us, that, you know, that, and even if we approach them in different ways, or we teach students how to, you know, explore them. I'm not sure if this idea of having a list or a canon in any form is, it seems to me just, again, I'm listening to the language we speak, you know, it's kind of a repository. This word came out just now, a repository. Like a kind of deadwood thing, you know, what our culture produced, or what this culture produced. It seems so static. And in fact, culture in the wild is not produced like this. And so cultural forms of all kinds, all through history and in many different cultures, are produced by very engaged multiple contexts, and it's not hermetic like that. I just find it. I find the approach of having a topic or studying a phenomenon. Let me give an example. from a course I teach about non-native literature and culture. So people producing in their second, third, and fourth languages, and not necessarily in post-colonial context, and not necessarily modern, but it's quite fascinating. So that you instead of staying with the text that you've studied and that you're used to, and then maybe add a few, you actually go on a voyage with your students, and they add to what, they feel very honored actually that you're exploring something with them that you don't have answers to. These are not texts that you're used to. You're saying, isn't that odd? This Indian woman goes to Italy and starts writing in Italian. How strange. Now what's going on here? Or we have music here that you have. What happens when a singer goes back and learns her native language, classical Arabic song, and starts writing music and producing music in between languages. So you get this list of things to study, which grows with student suggestions as well, what they know. And it's very interesting. It's not boring. You don't stay with another approach to the same text, or we have to keep it on there. It's very important. It's a classic. It's part of our culture. It's part of our history. You get away from that, and that's the way culture is produced anyway. It's not people in hermetic disciplines or cultures or languages like that. The best stuff has always been produced in extremely multiple contexts.
Anybody any comments on this? I can introduce a couple questions at this point that seem to pull on these issues. Is there a privileged Western canon or a set of canons coherent with an Anglo-American liberal arts education? Does these canonical roots of our liberal arts education somehow discourage or limit access beyond its horizons, right? And if we're going to talk about agglomeration and occlusion of identities and some kind of privileged notion of past, what is the alternative, right? What is this new relationship with the other, this new multiplicity that we're suggesting, and where do we reside with our students in between these two points of discourse and communication?
Well, I think I'll go next, since I brought the word agglomeration to us, which seems to be sticky. And it's sticky, no doubt, because agglomeration is something that happens. It doesn't need an argument for it. We will agglomerate. Think about Bergson's introduction to metaphysics, where he's ceaselessly concerned to try and invent a new metaphor. He's really worried about the ways that our metaphors rigidify our thinking. And he's worried about that because he wants to be attuned to the flow of life, to the way that everything is constantly in flux. And he simultaneously is acknowledging the inevitability of some kind of agglomerative forces. We do bureaucratize the imagination, as Kenneth Burke put it. It's a good way of putting it. We bureaucratize the imagination. We will. We don't need me to argue for it. I'm in fact not arguing for it. I don't think it's lovely. I'm just untroubled by it because the stance that I'm urging is one that I think of as pragmatic utopianism. And pragmatic utopianism is about naming the constraints that can't not persist into any future contiguous with the present, and then thinking about best possible futures.
If you're a professor in a university, are we allowed to do that?
Yeah,
also, where you are,
let me finish the thought. Let me finish the thought. By all means, intervene. Take issue, but let me finish the thought. I think what's at stake in thinking that way then is trying to say, what are the things we're stuck doing? We will do these things. If we're a professor at a university, if we're part of an institution, we will participate in a series of agglomerative forces. That's going to happen. And I think one of the things that sometimes structures conversations, especially in the humanities and the critical social sciences, is a very strong desire to be on the right side of history. If you're a professor in the university, in my view, you are not on the right side of history. We are not on the right side of history. That doesn't mean we can't do anything that's good. It doesn't mean that we can't take ethical stances. It doesn't mean that we can't try to disrupt the particularly well-codified flows of power that we also instantiate. We can, and we should. And we're also not on the right side of history. And so what's at stake, in my view, in curricular questions is always amelioration. We will be codifying a series of problematic elements of the world. Hopefully we're also doing some other things. Hopefully there's also space for newness, invention. Something happens that we haven't planned. And that happens partly in texts that students throw up. It happens in the ways of thinking, most importantly, that students develop that we hadn't seen in advance. Because we're talking about canons as a matter of collections of texts. But what agglomerates is all of the things that we care about. That's just as much modes of thought or processes of thought as it is particular texts. So I just wanted to note that what's at stake in my way of thinking about agglomeration isn't we ought to make sure that we collect the best in some way, but rather, given that we are going to helplessly collect some things, and whether those things are texts, other kinds of cultural artifacts, simply processes of thought, and if you hear each of our responses, all of us, we've articulated certain kinds of values regarding processes of thought that constitute a very Western canon. That is to say, they come out of our own education at universities in the United States and UK and Europe, etc. If we're going to be doing that, the question then to me has always to be, how can we invite students to participate in thinking through the ways that that will have happened, so that they can actually be more radical in their approaches than we, who have, let's be clear, chosen the side of power, can be. Thank you. Please.
No, that's all. I just wanted to. I really wanted to just interject.
Can you restate that interjection? Please.
No, I just said if you're this when you said that we will agglomerate, we will make collections, and I said it's not necessarily. I mean, it is our nature to do so, I suppose, in this context, in an institution, but this can be resisted. You cannot do that. I think you can choose not to do that by changing the way we teach a core curriculum. Like if you have basically topics courses, or
but that's the topics.
Yeah, good.
Well, actually,
yeah,
I wanted to
and topics are following a certain phenomenon that's very interesting that goes through, through space and geography. Geography and time, and cultures and languages, etc., and disciplines in unexpected ways that are new to us, that we enjoy following or discovering. That would be not collecting by definition. So what if, that's what this question I had this morning, what if we just dump that? And teach on this basis, and not have lists, and not have, the grades, and not have them. Yeah, I mean, this is
In a lot of ways, I was uncomfortable when I discovered, I don't know, belatedly, because you probably said it to me once here, that I was troubled by the focus of the session being on the canon, because, as I said, we at AUC have moved quite a ways away from it, and in fact, in the direction that you're talking about. So it is, we do still have it, and I talked about the philosophy course where we're sort of, you might say, mired in the canon, but that's maybe the nature of philosophy. But in terms of the required core course, it's disappeared. It's a much more minor part. And what we've found is that more and more the faculty are doing the kind of course you just mentioned, which is problem-oriented, topic-oriented courses that are focused on learning outcomes like critical thinking and reading, but not any sense of trying to inculcate an awareness of the canon. And I guess the thing is that I didn't try to accentuate that. And in fact, many of us do have questions about it, because it's like a pendulum moving in one direction. We had another person that was like you, a graduate of AUC, His name is Khalid Fahmy. He's at NYU. He was briefly back at AUC, and then he was kind of on the wrong side of the revolution. I don't think he's able to come back. So, anyways, but he had been through that program that we used to have, and for him, it changed his life. But unfortunately, not everyone is Khalid Fahmy. Not everyone's destined to be a PhD in history and make his mark. But it was, I mean, he was very opposed to this new direction where people were no longer paying attention to these eminent texts or significant books or whatever, the great books. But they were just reading, you know, from his point of view, kind of junk, just stuff. But it didn't really matter because, as you said, it was a question of getting students to think and following the topic, and that's all that mattered. So he was a very strong proponent, not as someone coming from the West, but as an Egyptian who nonetheless recognized, or as he put it, that it's really only by digging into these works that are worthwhile, that are troubling, that are valuable, that you really make progress in education. But where we've tended to go is towards developing classes that where the issue of a canon has become very much secondary. And I guess the only thing is that you have to wonder whether or not the end result of having students graduate from university who still put up their finger tentatively when they hear the word home, you know, is how we would feel about that. Whether there is something lost in that possibility, or whether this is ultimately just saying, you know, as you were saying, I mean, these are books that matter to us. I always found as a father that if I told my children that this book meant a lot to me, you know, when they're teenagers at least, they immediately resist it. And then they come back in their 20s and they say, you know, you remember that book you told me I should read? That was actually a really good book. You know, it's too bad I didn't listen to you. But eventually they find it themselves. So, you know, I mean, it raises a lot of interesting issues as to whether or not this agglomeration impulse will simply arise again. Even if we made a deliberate effort from now on, we will never tell anyone about our personal top 10 books of all time. But anyways, all right. Who else wants to talk about that?
I mean, I personally don't have any particular attachment to sort of a very specific list. But I think I do have an attachment, and I'm thinking aloud. I don't really have a very final form position on this. But I think I have an attachment to selecting from types. You know, I don't think that, I think I would challenge anybody really to say that when they put together a syllabus or a reading list, they aren't explicitly, and at the very least implicitly, selecting from types of texts. So, I mean, you know, I'm happy to hear a counter argument to that. But I think that there are, you know, certain types of, at the very least, certain types of thinking and types of writing that we are expecting. And that if we do not make an effort to help students develop that form or that mode of writing or thinking, then we're probably doing them a disservice. Even if we enter into the selection process telling ourselves, okay, we don't want to be restrained by a set of sort of classics. We want to be open. But if what ends up being the case is that they get exposed to a large number of texts that are very limited in the range and forms of argumentation or knowledge construction or whatever it is, then we're probably doing them a disservice, and we're not giving them the skills that they need. I mean, especially, I mean, so now, you know, with the internet culture, I mean, there is definitely this issue of sustained argumentation, right? That we all, I think, in our courses struggle with. That students have a fantastic skill of switching between topics quickly. And they remember a lot, and they're exposed to a lot. But they often don't have the skill of sustained argumentation. Now, I think at the very broadest level, that is at least something that one has to be making a selection about. You know, what is, and maybe on the other side, what is the nature of thought that is of this rapid shifting kind? I mean, maybe we need to be educated in that domain as well. Maybe there's something interesting there that we haven't ourselves figured out yet. But it's going to be a type. And there will be good examples of it if we figure what that is, and it's useful for some purpose. It's going to be a type, and then when we make selections for that type, it's going to, there are going to be good examples and bad examples. So I think I'll leave it at that.
I just lost my train of thought. Sorry, I was thinking about something you mentioned. So thinking back to the question that you posed, and which I'm looking at, sort of, is there a privileged, Western canon or set of canons, right? I mean, I think, yeah, there is. That's what we've been talking about. This is what we deal with here. This is what you've been talking about at AUC. This is what I think is something that we are all grappling with. And I don't mean to sort of constantly hammer this point, but I do want to bring it back to the specific locations and institutions that we're at, right? And also to think about the ramifications of privileging a particular set of texts or a canon or a core curriculum that revolves around the privileging of particular kinds of ideas and authors, and take it beyond and ground it, take it beyond the walls of our hallowed institutions. And I'm thinking about the point that you raised at the very end about sort of, the issue when someone tentatively raises their hand or their finger about Homer. And I think of the fact that probably very, 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 very few, there ought to no tentative fingers, their hands go up around, Abdullah al-Arwi or Ali Haram. Or, you can sort of name a whole set. And I want to just connect this, the privileging of the creation and the production of a hierarchy of knowledge when this happens, right? And it's not just about, abstractly arguing, oh, Western knowledge is better than Eastern knowledge, whatever. It's not, there are real world ramifications to this, which includes, irresponsible use of Arabic language sources by scholars or graduate students, right? Or thinking through, or using or assigning a particular text by, an Arab or Middle Eastern or medieval Muslim author as background simply for the more critical, westernized, privileged text that comes later, right? I mean, so I really think that there are actual ramifications connected to issues in translation, connected to the book market, both regional and international, that we cannot disengage from. We can't just talk about, thinking through a canon or curriculum as though it starts and stops here. It actually has multiple concentric manifestations or ramifications that we then have to deal with, right? The fact that you couldn't come up with, or that there was silence when you were thinking through your program, or the fact that there's so few translations, in fact, of particular kinds of texts. The fact that, the sort of narrative arc of modern Middle East history is more often than not always done with the point of reference of contact with, the quote-unquote West, right? Whereas there are so many other texts that actually could ground it, completely reframe that entire narrative. So I think that we need to remember what the purpose or what the argument around a canon or a core curriculum is. That's not just about, a program or about, indoctrination. I mean, I think the point that you made, Janine, is absolutely critical in terms of the language that we use, but that we not just reap the benefits, but we also all pay the price. Faculty, students, society, cultural production, all of this. And the stakes are, I think, high.
Yeah, I have a question. Sort of the elephant in the room for me is we're up at the American University in Cairo, and this is the American University of Beirut. Now, how are you limited by being in Lebanon? What does the government, does it restrict your instruction at all, or your choice of curriculum? I mean, obviously you're not the national University of Beirut. People who want to come here want an American education, or there's a Canadian school in Cairo, but they don't have anything to do with Canada. So how does American figure in your education here at the American University of Beirut?
I can answer maybe this question. The Lebanese government requires a certain number of credits in the major.
A certain number of
credits.
think the Lebanese government requires only a certain number of credits in the major in order to give a degree, to grant a degree. They are not concerned with the rest. So AUB is free to give all sorts of courses, provided they give a minimum number of credits in the major so that the degree granted is recognized by the Lebanese government as, you know, a BA degree. I think that's it. But they do not interfere in the content of the other course.
But they receive the full dossier of
Yeah, but yeah, that's it. But they need to make sure that the degree you are granting is conform with the other degree. So,
concerning censorship, I realize there's no governmental censorship here, and there isn't in Egypt, and it doesn't affect AUC. But there is social censorship. I remember when we first started teaching the core seminar at AUC in the 80s, we used to have selections from the Bible and the Quran, along with other works. Now, we cannot do it. I mean, it's not that anybody is telling us we cannot do it, but people are worried about what will happen, you know. Some of us teaching courses, I mean, I teach Dante and I have to introduce them to Canto 28 and so on. I mean, I try to do it in such a way as to present to them that what's coming is going to be very offensive to people who believe in the prophet and so on. The same thing when I do Chaucer and so on. So there are ways of doing it, but there is also this implicit censorship that comes from below and not from above. So I don't know if that affects what you do.
There's another form of censorship here that comes and goes. And one thing that's going on right now is the Minister of Labor is not wanting universities to hire non-Lebanese. And there's pressure on the universities to not do that. So I was on a search committee, and the dean was like, look at this, you know, I noticed this person amongst the applicants in this one. And I was like, no, that doesn't work. And these people that are actually, you know, one is a Canadian, one is that are completely not Lebanese, somehow I just got word that the hiring, they were rejected before we even found out about it. And it was, they won't give them work permits. And what this does is a bit, you know, what you were saying about the liberal arts colleges that in New England, what, you know, we're discussing something and worrying about canons and lists, and they've moved way beyond that. But it is very good for institutions to have people coming from other worlds, so that we so that we have other models and other ideas. And if we're not allowed to hire anyone that's not rooted here, then that's a kind of censorship, not of books necessarily, but indirectly. So I think.
Sorry, just before you pass it to Peter, isn't there a set of books in the AUC library that are verboten? Isn't there like 50 to 60 books?
That are what? No, what was at one point a problem is when you assign a text to your students, and if these books are bought from outside, then there is censorship on these books, like it happened with Hamad Shokri by Red Arrow and so on. But in the library, they can have these books. Actually, I talked to the censors at the time, you know. He said you can have them in the library, but you cannot order them, you know, to sell, you know, to a multitude of people. But I think these things also change from year to year.
Right, different policy, different sensitivity.
I remember once I was teaching a course on gender and literature and gender, okay? And I ordered Toni Morrison, Beloved. That was censored because they thought it's about love. I had Alice Walker, In Trouble, In Love and In Trouble. That was censored. And there was a book by Asir Jabbar on Shahrazad's sister. The translation was on Shahrazad's sister. That was censored. But the one that really had lots of sex in it, which is by Adele Swave, In the Eye of the Sun, they let it go because they judge by the title. That's how censors work.
But doesn't it goes beyond censorship. As I understand, there's been professors who've been relieved of duty who've taught texts that were later on criticized by Islamic authorities outside the institution, outside the AUC. There were professors who were eliminated. Is that not the case?
There was
in the literature department, is that not right?
no, there was a professor who was teaching Roldanson on Muhammad.
Yes.
And he was adjunct, he was part-time, he was French.
Okay.
And then he was not renewed. But Samia Mehrez was teaching for bread alone. You know, she continues to teach, and she continues to teach them.
Let's turn to Peter and then to Bana. Peter?
Well, basically, just a few items about censorship. Even before the war, before things got very, very sensitive, once I was called into a gendarmerie because we were doing Hedda Gabler, not because I liked the play particularly, but we were doing Hedda Gabler, and they wanted to make sure this wasn't, you know, this doesn't happen anymore. So I think actually we've had a. But what the war did bring in was definitely the whole question of religious sensitivity. So we weren't able to then teach the Bible or the Quran, or even the Sharia and Shiite theology texts we used to use regularly in our courses. They all have gone out. And Maher Jarrah and myself started to do this in a specific course with just very limited thing. And the experience I've had in that is that properly handled and within CVSP, and if we put the parameters on that, if you're talking about the people here, they really respond to it. If you're handling it, knowing you're doing this here, you're not in a vacuum, you know who it is you're dealing with, you can really find, you can do without compromising any truth or any scholarship, you can find sufficient things in those texts to help people understand what's going on in the world, what's going on around here, and believe it or not, to draw people closer to one another. Atheists, Christians, Muslims can all be human, even when looking at, find a common humanity. But there is censorship. The other thing this social censorship. The other two items, one very recent, and that is we still teach Al-Ghazali, since Al-Ghazali was mentioned, we teach Al-Ghazali's Munqidh min al-Dalal, deliverance from error. And at some time previously we decided that the section on the Batinites, since we no longer were teaching anything from Shia, the whole Shia world, that we wouldn't deal with it, and pedagogically let them know why. We're not interested in hearing, even no matter whether you agree or you disagree with Al-Ghazali about this. He's speaking about something where you're never going to have anyone give you a response. So we thought it was a very good, academic reason, and those of us who knew about it would always explain this to the students. We kept the text there. Recently, some people want to take the text out because they were saying, well, if the text is left there, inevitably some students want to discuss it, and in this heated atmosphere we're in, take it out. So what happened? We started to get out, from the student newspaper, request for interview with the director and then with myself, and the person who came to me because I was able to give a full history of what had happened. And, what I thought was reassuring about how we were trying to handle this academically, scholarly, humanly, social consciously, whatever. I thought I did a pretty good job, and she seemed to be responding to me, very well. And my son, who's in between different jobs, he's now teaching at LAU. He comes to me and he says, a student came to me and told me, how come you've all removed Al-Ghazali from the text, from the syllabus? So we have removed Al-Ghazali from the syllabus. I explained to him what happened. We said, the person who interviewed said, yes, well, it was a nice interview, but we didn't get the answer we wanted. So there's a very there's a very charged atmosphere going on. And so this social pressure is, that was mentioned by Faryab, is certainly there. But why am I mentioning this? I think we need to be aware of what's going on in the world out there when we're teaching some of these texts. And therefore, to my mind, a classic is a text that still speaks to people individually and socially, and yet still has life in it. And I always found myself using this thing between tradition and traditionalism, the way I define it, not, it can be used any other way. So tradition is something that has come to us that had life in it or wouldn't have lived this long, and still has potential life in it. Traditionalism is when you respond to it by wanting to fossilize it, idolize it, make it eminent, make it, give these terms to it. But a text that has survived, has spoken to people in different cultures all over the world, has survived the test of time and cultural difference, has some worth in it as an example to take a look at it critically. See, well, what is the life in it? How is it? How can it be? How can it give dead life? And so you're teaching. I think in the courses we teach, I like to do the two. I don't like the pedestal gutter model as I seem to be hearing. It's either to be done away with because it's in the gutter, or no. In between, I think what we've been trying to do at our best over the years is never worship anything. I mean, most of the things I teach, I don't like. I criticize personally, and so it's not like we're just worshiping them, but they have life in them. They are in the vocabulary of things that it's kind of giving them an alphabet and a vocabulary, so when they come across many things, they still come across in the world of theater, in the world of opera, in the world of music, in the world of art. It still connects in some sort of a way. So as far as I'm concerned, I never understood what the word canon really meant, because we lived here in Lebanon. Canons meant things that were coming down on us. But rather, and I understand perfectly well, we don't want to sort of get stuck on some particular text. But there are texts that have shown to continue to speak to people that you can criticize and you can appreciate and give them as a good model of being able. So what Richard was saying, sorry, one last thing. What Richard was saying was the last, the thing is that text should be something we can help them to get skills that they can then use on everything else they read. But I think at the same time, it's also a text that should be able to give them a window into many other artistic, but in the rest of the world.
Thank you. I think Rob has a response.
A quick comment. When you were speaking of the pedestal and so on, I didn't get a chance to give Nietzsche's view of himself, but it is not a hierarchical tree. Although I had a picture of a tree, it is more of the rhizome. But Nietzsche also, the pedestal issue, his book Twilight of the Idols. People think Nietzsche wants to philosophize with a hammer, meaning he wants to smash everything to bits. But as you probably know, in fact, what he says is he wants to tap on these statues, these things that we idolize, these things that we've allowed, the values that we've allowed to ossify, and essentially find out if they still have life in them. And I think that comes back to your point about troubling texts. These things need to be tested with a hammer, but not in a totally destructive way, but in a deconstructive way, which is basically to see if, you don't put them up on pedestals, but you also don't necessarily put them in the gutter, but rather you're testing them constantly to see if they still have life, if they still have blood, if they still challenge us. And if they don't, then yes, bring them down and move on. But I think that's really the very key image.
Banan and then Frank.
Thanks. Two things. One, very quickly about the censorship issue. I think there are lots of books that are censored here, because I know there's a section in the library that you can only go to. They'll give you the book, you can't leave with it, and you can't photocopy anything from it, so you're only allowed to read in that little room. So there are some books like that here. Second thing about the canon, I'm going to give you a very naive, sort of very pragmatic understanding, and I wonder whether it's being over-intellectualized. I think everyone in this room agrees that there are maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of books that are canonicals or classics that people should read. I remember, from Lebanon, I got to read at AUB, I got to read some Arabic texts, and when I went to do my PhD in the States, my friends would be like, "You've never read the Federalist Papers?" I'd be like, "No." "You've never read, Seasons of Migration to the North?" And that's okay, right? That's fine. And I want to go back to what Richard was saying, which is, and Peter picked up on it, which is that we're teaching critical skills, right? But why do we have to have a set canon? Just because it's practical. We, in the philosophy department, we try to do this restructuring of the MA program, especially the comprehensive exam. We try to tailor each exam to each student, and then we just found out it was difficult. It was practically difficult. And so we decided, what we need to do is we need to have a list of exams, and that's going to just depend on whoever's on the committee at the time. Right? It's much. Everyone agrees there are hundreds and thousands of books that people should read. Right? They're excellent. They're fantastic. Whether it's in philosophy, in literature, in science, but we can't teach them all. So whoever the committee who's going to put together this core curriculum is just going to select a bunch of them. And as long as they're not making a course of philosophy that's exclusively Alain de Botton or self-help books, I think we're okay. I don't think there's like a right answer to the set of canons.
Great. And then Ira?
Just to continue with this thought and the question on the canon and what is to be studied, I suppose. I was thinking, I don't know who mentioned Gadamer this morning. This is what brought this idea to my mind. I'm thinking of these texts as prejudice in the sense that Gadamer gives to the word, of course, in reaction to the Enlightenment, but I think he's right in saying that they are prejudgments. In other words, these texts can also be viewed, we can add this dimension, as prejudgments. Why are we seeing them as prejudgments? If today we are seeing them as prejudgments, it means there are issues today that the texts that we are considering and studying have a certain answer to, allow them to ask certain questions about things that they are dealing with today. And it's in that sense that Gadamer sees the prejudgments on any issue. They make the issue very rich because they allow it to be a problematic concept that you can deal with and develop.
The printer's going to get caught on the table. That's great.
As a rhetorician, it's sort of odd for me to find myself in the position of wanting to talk about the particular content, because what we're most interested in disciplinarily and have been for 2,500 years is how people do things. But I think one of the things that's been most interesting intellectually and rich intellectually about critical thought in the last 50 years has been the idea that you don't get to not choose some set of things that have force for the next person. So even if you think about every faculty committee chooses whatever it wants, as Simone de Beauvoir notes in Pour une morale de l'ambiguïté, where she's pretending that she's explicating Sartre, and instead she's writing a fantastic theory of human freedom. She notes that human freedom is always responsive to the weight of the situation. And I think this is some of what Nadia is highlighting, is that one set of text that is there constitutes a situation. We negotiate that situation, but we're not able, however we might wish to be, to simply dispense with it. I want to add to that a little bit. It's not just one set of books, and this is some of the point I've been trying to make. A sense of canonicity runs through the sets of values that we determine are the goods. So that happens also in program learning outcomes. And in fact, unacknowledged or unnegotiated program learning outcomes, as we know, serve directly the aims of the neoliberal university. How can we quantify everything? I don't think that that's the way you're talking about it at all, but that is the unnegotiated meaning of the program learning outcome. Let's quantify everything. All human experience can be transformed into exchange value of one sort or another. And I think one of the things probably everybody on this panel wants, and one of the reasons why we care about the specificity of our situation, is to be in a process of negotiating meaning together with the notion that that has political consequences. That there's not simply something that happens in the university, and then that's done. And then people walk away and they go through their lives, and we give them the grades that allow for a system of transnational corporate control to sort them into their proper jobs. But rather, they become capable in ways that they may not have initially been, or more capable in ways, if they were initially, of making new possibilities of meaning that we haven't foreseen. This is where actually I'm not, in terms of aims, I don't think we're at odds at all in that regard. We want, I think, this is why should we have a liberal arts curriculum? Why should we be consciously and actively negotiating canon both at the level of texts and at the level of core values? Because our doing that and our including our students in that process is how we help our students form a world that's not structured by the situation that has structured us. if we look around us and we look at the world, and the first thought of critique, of critique, of judgment, is to say, the world doesn't work. It's not good. We have no evidence for the progressive thesis that things are getting better all the time. Candide's most excellent tutor's suggestions notwithstanding. One of the things that we want then is to help our students imagine better possible worlds in negotiation of actually existing situations. And I think as much as I personally don't really have a dog in any particular textual canon fight, it's it's a terrible metaphor, sorry. Yeah, it's a horse in a canon race. Let's choose. We're colonized by discourses of violence. And one of the ways that we negotiate that is by making very clear, and that's why, to respond to Richard's question before, I think it matters a great deal, actually, which texts. Yes, I mean, I care a lot about process. I specifically, at any given moment, care more about process than about which texts. Should we read Aristotle or Socrates? Should we consider the fact that we don't read Aspasia? Yeah, we should. Because when we consider that, we think about what the tradition that makes it possible for us to exist as a certain kind of subject means and could yet mean that we haven't yet seen. And that's why I think that these conversations aren't at all over-intellectualized or unnecessary, but in fact, politically, vibrant and critical.
Oh, Edward.
Yeah, just something very quick. Yeah, I find the discussion fascinating. And yeah, since you mentioned Gadamer, which I spoke about this morning, I think in that little meditation he has on what is the meaning of the classical, I think everything I've heard here is considered by Gadamer. And he goes even a step further, I think, or maybe deeper, with respect to your point about the prejudiced prejudgments, and says without these prejudgments we're not human. And we can't not have these prejudgments. And the analogy is that we can't choose to exist initially. We simply find ourselves existing. All then we can do is choose not to exist, which is suicide. But even there, then it's questionable as to whether or not that ends our existence. So anyway, I found the topic fascinating, and I agree with you. It's not over-intellectualizing. It's very important and fascinating discussion. Thank you. Thanks to everyone.
Patricia.
Yes. Thank you. Well, I would echo Edward in saying it's been really, really fascinating and really interesting. So I have a few things, and I think they might seem disconnected, so I'll try to connect them together. But the first thing that I found myself thinking in maybe the first 15 to 20 minutes of this panel is that I can't remember the last time I heard anyone use the word canon. So I asked myself, does that mean, without missing a single word any of you said, I asked myself, does that mean that we're blindly and uncritically waltzing through life teaching the same things over and over? And I thought, no. And I think it speaks to various points that you've made, and also over there, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but yes, Ban. And then, is it Peter? Peter, yes. So I think you'll hear some echoes of what's been said. And it has to do with the issue of translatability. So when you were talking about certain kinds of courses, I immediately thought of the global core, because in fact, although we're trying to have faculty stretch, there's still faculty specialization. And there are certain global core courses that I would never attempt to teach. And in one that I teach, which is called Staging the Mediterranean, and in 16th and 17th centuries, there are some really arcane documents that I use that nobody would consider great art in any sense of the word, but they work to this argument. They work to what I'm trying to get, the complexity that I'm trying to get the students to understand. So then I asked myself, for a core curriculum
would your suggestion work? And it seems to me it only works insofar as it's not a core curriculum in which everybody's taking the same course. Because this issue of specialization does come in, and it's important. And so I was thinking about, I mean, it is the case that we deal with Greek and Roman works and works from Western Europe. And it's a tradition, which the word was used. One work that didn't work, unfortunately, was Roswitha of Gandersheim, 10th century Ottonian abbess, and we were looking for women writers, quite frankly, and she'd written these theatrical hagiographies. Well, she has the unfair distinction of being the only person tossed off the list after 1 year. She didn't even make the 2-year commitment that we usually make, because the faculty found it impossible to get past the horrifying nature of martyrdom. So one of the stories is the mother encourages each of her 3 daughters, faith, hope, and charity, to leap into the boiling oil in order to defy the Roman emperor. And people just kept saying, I don't know how to teach this. I can't find a way in. And so I think that that rather than venerating Plato or worshiping Augustine, it's that these works, as others have said, have withstood the test of time. They offer so many ways in. And in fact, most of the Lit Hum faculty, I'm not sure about CC, but most of the Lit Hum faculty finds through lines of arguments to make the course for themselves somewhat topical or thematic. So, and nobody is told which ones they need to follow through. So for example, I often do something like art, memory, remembrance. What are the ways in which people remember, and follow that through? Or self-knowledge. And of course the students like that. Other people do something like, what in the various works. It's not the only thing they talk about in the works, but they find a way to return to the topic. What is considered just? What is justice? Who administers it? Who benefits from it? Who suffers from it? So anyway, I wanted to make the point, first of all, that I don't know if we're using euphemisms to avoid using the word canon, as much as we want the students to understand that we think these are works that have withstood the test of time, but by using a word like canon, it really does perpetuate a sense that these are fossilized and that somehow you can't approach them critically. And that's not what we want to do. And I think I'm not sure why this why this leaped to mind, but it is the case that in different places, and I'm sure in the United States in different institutions, it's whatever they choose for their core curriculum, they are considering a history of us. And I don't think that's what we do at Columbia. We certainly make connections between the evolution of democracy and the works in CC, but it isn't a history of the West or a history of us. It really is a way to engage with significant ideas. And I gave a talk in Colombia, which spawned endless days of jokes about Colombia. But when I mentioned Cervantes, because they wanted to institute in this one school a core curriculum, and I said something about Cervantes, and they said, no, Cervantes, don't want the oppressor. They said Aristotle and Plato, that's our heritage. Oh, so the idea of thinking about these core courses as heritage courses is something that's not really what I think when I think about what core courses should be. But again, I want to thank you all. You've given me a lot to think about, as you've heard, and I'm going to keep thinking about these things, and I'm going to think about euphemisms and donors.
Mr. Hassan.
Sorry, thank you for really this very lively discussion, and if I may just pick up where we just left off, I guess. And I premise it by being a bit troubled that I haven't been troubled enough, perhaps, by the fact that I haven't been thinking of, I've been teaching, let me just say, actually, I'm a student of this institute when there was the 4 courses. So I was Canon in indoctrinated, canonized, no, right? But, and then I've been teaching it now for 12 years, and certainly canon to me was never an issue, nor was heritage. Much of what we read, I don't think qualifies as heritage, and to be very honest, why should it? But to my mind, it was always a question of, here's a text that to some people back then was canon. I mean, when it gets to the point that Thomas Aquinas no longer feels he needs to say Aristotle, but simply say the philosopher, right? That's canon at some level. And with my students, the question has always been, what made that person? Why? Right? As Ira said at one point, why did that person become canon at that time? Why did someone take the time, and I'm sure it took time, to carve the Epic of Gilgamesh on those tablets? Not just one set, because as we know, this is what's come down to us is from many tablets, right? When it gets to the contemporary, I think is more the discussion of what we think is canon. And to be honest, I don't think is canon, right? But I do realize that the question is there. But I'm going to allow myself to say there's also meta-canon. And I've heard a lot of it today, which is Foucault is becoming meta-canon. Marx is becoming meta-canon. Said, Freud is becoming meta-canon. And I think that's fine. Again, in the sense that why, not what. I think it's very important to come back to think, well, why is that text on that syllabus, rather than what text is on the syllabus. That's it. Thank you.
I'm going to throw in a curveball because I think Honey introduced it. I wasn't going to necessarily push this, but I'm going to try and see where it takes us. It's to turn the table on the notion of canon and put the critical light on the issue of criticality and a type of new subjectivity that is emphasized so enthusiastically by us teachers. So, on the relationship between criticism and canon, how do we teach criticism without falling into this? How do we teach criticism? This is for you. How do we teach criticism without falling into a new kind of canonicity that fetishizes criticality? Is critical thinking an educational end in itself, as you might come to think from listening to us? How do we situate students as well as ourselves between these 2 points? The so-called authoritarian and pragmatic notion of canonical authority on the one hand, and the new fetishism of criticism. That is ultimately between the authority of a past subjectivity and the authority of a present subjectivity. So given that we've kind of emerged to this point, I thought I'd throw this out here as a last-ditch effort, although not much seems necessary to keep you guys going. So does anybody have anything they want to say on this? I think Hani sort of talked about this new emphasis, where the Foucault's, the social criticism becomes an end in itself and spawns a new canon.
It's not really a response to your question,
sure.
But one, to say that whoever would like coffee should perhaps go grab one. But also, perhaps another way to put it that might be slightly less complicated is the relationship between criticality and empathy. Maybe, if we can put it that way, since empathy is precisely at the heart of what we claim we're supposed to be doing. What does that mean? What does it actually mean to be empathetic to a text or an idea?
It's interesting, we were talking about Gadamer seems to be in the room with us, and you know, I mean, this whole, it's a very interesting idea. I mean, this melding of worlds and so on, and you have to wonder whether it's some kind of a Kantian ideal, because you know, I mean, I don't think, I think you have to ask whether there's, what the possibility is of trying to empathize with these canonical figures that lived, you know, thousands of years ago or whatever. But at the same time, when you enter into a text, there's no question that you do have to enter into the text. That is and this is something that I learned as an undergraduate, that I made sure my students understand and my kids understand, which is that if you start by saying, "Oh, this guy's an idiot," you know, you're just not going to get anywhere, right? I mean, you have to have this suspension of disbelief and this effort to enter into the text, to try to understand how it works, to try to understand its internal logic, and then to step back and take the you know, or in some cases to let the text and again, this wonderful reference that was made earlier, the texts themselves can be self-reflective, so that within the text itself there is these questions and layers and elements of irony and depth and so on, where the text sort of turns on itself. And so on. So I mean, you know, it's an impossible task, but a necessary task, it seems to me. And I think that there is. I mean, in other words, as undergraduates, I did it, and others are tempted to do it, which is just to take immediately a superior, hostile attitude towards this thing, and as you said, fetishize criticality. Oh, I can find flaws with this, you know. But I mean, I think the first you have to sort of see the inherent strengths. And someone like Descartes, I mean, you know, I mean that's why it's worthwhile to go through his proofs for the existence of God, because on some levels they're laughable, on other levels they're quite compelling, and then you get to different levels, you know. I mean, so that's I think again this sense of the troubling texts, that they have both this. They challenge us on these various kinds of levels. So, anyways, it's an excellent question, and I think it is actually very relevant to what you were raised here.
I think perhaps we could view it once again, to continue, as a question of, at the same time, jouissance and the meaning Derrida gives to the word when talking of texts, of course, and perhaps the renegotiation of the term desire and the anti-Oedipus of Deleuze, not Deleuze, sorry, yes, of Deleuze, and the desire as we see it in Plato, as a lack. I think what we're doing is actually saying, I can have both. In other words, I can enter this text and have a certain satisfaction, very strong jouissance of the text, an orgasmic presence with the text, and then represent it to myself again. In other words, always take this distance, that is a critical distance. But criticality then makes the critical distance itself absent once again, and we enter into a jouissance of the critical as such. So I think it's something we want to maintain. It's something that's very good to have this constant movement. And in very, very simplistic terms, we don't get bored with the text if we do this.
We'll end with this comment because we don't want to push Peter.
Okay, I just wanted to talk to Patricia for a second. I was just thinking about what you said. Yeah. I was wondering when you said the students wouldn't take all the same course, and your idea of a history of us, and I can't help but to see that this worry about not all taking the same course is a kind of history of us. And then the other idea, which is texts that have stood the test of time, or, you know, the martyrs, you know, here, children, jump in the boiling oil. Texts that we can't enter, we don't know how to enter. This is all common terrain that is built into institutions, and I want to go back to the language of statesmen and canons and donors. And I really think, you know, we can have a critical view of that, but I think there's a certain extent where that is what is going on, and that it is a very, and I really liked your comment about not being troubled enough. I actually agree with you. We like to say that, but I'm not really sure if we are in our common ground. We tend to hold on to that institutionally, with power, with money, with, you know, forms of teaching and knowledge that we cannot, there's too much resistance, as you said in your talk, to changing it. But I think it's a very, the troubling point is when, you know, John Milton, when he could claim to have read everything that was ever written, that final hour in Europe that ended, you know, in multiple languages. Auerbach goes to Istanbul and he looks around and he thinks, oh my God, you know, this is endless. Like if we were to claim to have knowledge and to explore texts and to, you know. So this moment where you enter into another world that has texts and richness and traditions that you have no access to at all. And they don't know your texts. They don't feel that they've lasted the test of time. They have another set. But you have enough access that you can enter, you know, you have linguistic access, or you start to explore that. It's a very troubling moment, and it's a very rich one. And that's the edge that it seems to me a core curriculum needs to cross, in my view.
Can we?
We're right on the verge of the notion of civilization, which we're not going to be able to enjoy bringing up. Let me act as a statesman and thank you all for your presence here.